In the stillness of a quiet Victorian evening, the city seemed to breathe in a different rhythm. Gas lamps flickered along the narrow cobblestone streets, their dim glow casting uncertain halos that struggled against the thick fog rolling in from the Thames. The world outside whispered with the sound of carriage wheels and the distant clop of hooves. But behind shuttered windows and thick velvet curtains, another kind of life unfolded, one that carried within it secrets so dangerous, yet cloaked in elegance. It was the world of beauty, refinement, and deadly powders that promised allure but concealed a slow march toward ruin. The women of the era, bound by both societal expectation and their own yearning to embody ideals of purity and perfection, turned to cosmetics that were, in truth, silent killers. The pale, ethereal complexion that was so highly prized did not come naturally to most. It had to be crafted, painted, layered upon the skin with products whose ingredients carried the heavy weight of arsenic, lead, and mercury. The story begins in one such sitting room, warmly lit by the fire, yet laced with the faint scent of lavender water and something more sinister, the metallic tang of powder freshly applied. Lady Margaret Whitfield sat before her looking-glass, a towering oval framed in gilded wood, its surface slightly warped with age. The flicker of candlelight softened her features, lending her a fragile glow. On the small table before her lay an array of cosmetic jars, brushes, and cloths. Each jar bore elegant script, promising purity, refinement, and beauty. The powders sparkled faintly in the low light, white as snow, yet carrying within them the essence of poison. Her maid Anne moved quietly, preparing another jar, her hands slightly trembling as though she understood far more than she dared to say. Margaret's face was already layered with Venetian ceruse, a powder known for its dazzling whiteness. What she did not fully grasp, or perhaps did not wish to dwell upon, was that ceruse was made from white lead. Its fine texture clung to her pores, suffocating them, seeping into her skin. Over time, it would inflame her flesh, leaving sores and weakness. But for now, it gave her the look of otherworldly refinement that society adored. She leaned closer to the mirror, tracing the curve of her cheek with a delicate fingertip, admiring the illusion she had crafted. Outside her chamber, the world was changing. Industrial smoke thickened the skies, and disease haunted the poorer districts. Yet in parlors and ballrooms, beauty was its own kind of armor, a performance that allowed women like Margaret to move within the delicate circles of wealth and influence. A pale face, untouched by the sun, suggested refinement and purity. Ruddy cheeks hinted at labor, at the touch of the outside world, and thus were shunned. To be pale was to be above toil, to embody the delicate fragility of porcelain. And so, women painted themselves with powders and creams, never fully acknowledging the toll. Anne, setting aside the last jar, finally spoke. "Milady, perhaps tonight you might wear less?" Her voice was hesitant, as though she feared even this small suggestion might be taken as insolence. Margaret did not look away from the mirror. "Less?" she echoed, a small smile playing at her lips. "Anne, when Lord Whitfield escorts me into that hall, do you imagine they will see me as I am or as I appear? No, they see only what is painted, what is crafted. That is what they remember." Anne's eyes lowered. She had seen, in the quiet hours when Margaret was without her powders, the marks beginning to form along her jawline, faint discolorations that no amount of lavender water could soothe. She had read whispers in pamphlets warning of the dangers, yet those warnings never seemed to reach the drawing rooms of ladies such as her mistress. The evening stretched onward. Margaret dressed, her gown a flowing cascade of silk in muted ivory, adorned with tiny pearls at the sleeves. As Anne tightened the laces of her corset, Margaret's breath grew shallow, though she gave no complaint. The gown shimmered in the dim light, but the true finishing touch was her face, the powdered whiteness, the subtle rouge brushed upon her cheeks, and the faint glimmer of kohl darkening her lashes. To any onlooker, she would appear radiant, almost angelic. Only the mirror bore silent witness to the truth hidden beneath. The carriage ride to the Whitfield estate's grand hall was short, but every bump of the road stirred the unease that Anne carried in her chest. She watched her mistress's profile in the half-light, admiring her beauty, yet wondering how much of it was truly her own. Margaret sat upright, regal, every detail of her presentation honed to perfection. Outside, the city flickered past, shadows of chimney stacks, glimpses of lanterns, and the silhouettes of those less fortunate trudging home from labor. By the time they entered the hall, the air was filled with music, the sweet strains of violins and the hum of polite conversation. Crystal chandeliers glittered above, scattering light across gowns and jewels, across faces powdered and painted into masks of elegance. Margaret stepped forward, taking Lord Whitfield's arm, her smile delicate and poised. She knew the gazes that followed her, the whispers that trailed behind. "Divine," one voice murmured. "So pale, so refined," said another. For a time, the illusion was complete. No one questioned the faint glisten of sweat beneath her powder, nor the occasional stiffness in her movements. She was what they expected her to be, a vision of Victorian beauty. Yet as the evening drew long, Margaret felt a faint dizziness creeping upon her. It was subtle, a small spinning at the edges of her vision. She ignored it, choosing instead to lean more heavily upon her husband's arm, disguising her weakness as an act of intimacy. Anne, standing among the servants at the edge of the room, saw it all. Her heart clenched as she realized the truth she could not speak aloud. Beauty was killing her mistress, one layer at a time. The hours passed with laughter and music, but when Margaret finally returned to her chamber, the mask began to crumble. The moment Anne unfastened the gown and loosened the corset, Margaret let out a sigh, her shoulders sagging as though she carried not only the weight of fabric, but the burden of expectation. The mirror reflected her once more, and though the powder remained intact beneath it, she felt the rawness of her skin, the burning of sores hidden just beneath the surface. She did not let Anne see her pain, but in the quiet crackle of the fire, in the silence of the room, the truth lingered unspoken. And thus the story begins, not with a dramatic cry, not with sudden revelation, but with the slow, silent unfolding of a secret. For in the Victorian world, beauty was not simply a matter of vanity. It was a performance, a shield, and at times, a death sentence. The tale of toxic beauty does not reveal itself in a single evening, but rather in countless small moments, powder brushed upon the skin, rouge dabbed upon the lips, the faint dizziness that becomes a constant companion. Each moment is a thread in a tapestry of deception, where elegance hides decay and admiration blinds truth. Margaret, like so many of her time, would walk this path unaware of how far it reached, how deeply it dug into the very essence of life itself. As Anne extinguished the candles and the room sank into shadow, Margaret lay awake, her face still powdered, her thoughts still caught in the echo of compliments and glances. She believed perhaps that beauty had been her triumph that evening. But in the still darkness, with only the faint scent of lavender and powder lingering, the question remained. At what cost? The following morning in London arrived muted, veiled in a haze of mist that rolled in from the river and seeped between the narrow streets. The Whitfield home stood solemn, its tall brick facade catching only a pale sliver of sunlight that struggled to pierce through the fog. Inside, the grand rooms echoed with a quiet stillness. Servants moved about with soft steps, polishing silver, arranging flowers, and attending to the endless tasks that maintained the illusion of elegance. Yet within Lady Margaret's private chamber, the morning began with a ritual more intimate, more insidious, and more dangerous than any guest at the previous evening's ball could imagine. Anne carried in the tray, her hands balancing porcelain cups of tea, a plate of sugared biscuits, and a small bowl of crushed herbs meant to freshen the air. Yet alongside these harmless comforts lay the inevitable jars, the powders, the creams, the rouges that Margaret demanded each day. They were lined neatly across the dressing table like sacred relics. The maid placed the tray down gently and stole a glance at her mistress, who was still reclining on the bed, the heavy velvet curtains drawn shut against the morning. Margaret stirred slowly, her head heavy, her breath shallow. She had not slept well. Dreams, strange and uneasy, had chased her through the night, leaving her body restless. Yet as her eyes fluttered open, her first thought was not of discomfort, but of her appearance. She reached for the mirror that lay upon the nightstand and tilted it toward her face. The powder from the night before remained faintly visible, clinging stubbornly to her pores, dulling the redness of her inflamed skin. Anne hesitated before speaking. "Milady, perhaps you might rest a while longer. The morning is still young." But Margaret shook her head. "Rest, Anne, is a luxury I cannot afford. There will be callers today. Do you suppose I can receive them in this state?" She gestured faintly toward her face, the small blemishes hidden beneath the powder, the faint swelling around her eyes. Anne swallowed her words. She knew well enough that Margaret's visitors cared little for her true self. They wished only to see the performance of refinement, the porcelain figure that society adored. And so, silently, Anne moved to prepare the table. The first jar to be opened was the ceruse, the familiar white powder that promised radiance but carried poison in every grain. Anne lifted the lid, and the faint metallic scent reached her nose. She had grown accustomed to it, yet every time it sent a shiver through her. She dipped a soft cloth into the powder and began dabbing it gently across Margaret's face. Layer upon layer, the pallor deepened, until the natural flush of her skin was erased, replaced by a mask of porcelain. Margaret closed her eyes, breathing slowly. There was a quiet satisfaction in the ritual. With each touch, each layer, she felt the woman she feared, the tired, blemished, imperfect self, fade away. In her place rose the image she had cultivated, serene, pale, untouchable. When Anne finished, she reached for the rouge, a delicate tint of vermilion, bright and lively, carefully brushed upon the cheeks and lips. It was quicksilver in its seduction, but the pigment was derived from mercury salts, another invisible chain binding Margaret to her fate. The faint glow of color brought her face to life, making her look youthful, but every application was another step toward weakness, tremors, and decline. Margaret gazed at herself in the mirror, her lips curving faintly. "There," she whispered. "Do you see, Anne? How could anyone doubt me now?" Anne only nodded. But inside, a storm of words fought to escape. She wanted to speak of the pamphlet she had once read, a warning published by a physician who claimed these powders were no better than slow poison. She wanted to tell Margaret of the women she had known in her village, their faces scarred and their bodies frail, their beauty eroded by the very paints that once exalted them. Yet Anne's voice remained silent, trapped by the boundaries of her station. Later that afternoon, visitors did arrive. The drawing room filled with the rustle of skirts, the laughter of ladies, and the polite murmur of gentlemen. Margaret presided over it all, radiant as ever, her pale skin glowing in the firelight, her lips a delicate rose. Compliments flowed like wine. How elegant she looked, how youthful, how refined. Every word was a balm, soothing the unease that had gnawed at her through the night. Yet as the hours wore on, Margaret's hands began to tremble slightly. She hid it well, folding them neatly in her lap, pressing them against her skirts to still the quiver. Only Anne, standing quietly in the corner, noticed the small betrayals, the faint sheen of sweat along her mistress's temple, the way her posture stiffened as though to disguise weakness, the way she sipped her tea more slowly, carefully, as though each swallow required effort. By evening, when the guests had departed and the house had grown quiet again, Margaret allowed herself to collapse into the chair by the fire. Anne moved to remove the layers of powder, dampening a cloth with lavender water and wiping gently across her mistress's face. Beneath the powder, the truth emerged. Small sores along the jawline, the redness of inflamed skin, the subtle swelling that spoke of irritation. Margaret winced, but said nothing. "Shall I call for the physician, milady?" Anne whispered. Margaret shook her head firmly. No, what would he say? That I must give up my powders, abandon the only thing that grants me dignity in this house? That I must step into society as myself, unpainted, imperfect? No, Anne, that is not an option. The fire crackled softly, its light dancing across the walls. Anne pressed her lips together, her heart heavy. She knew her mistress's words were born of truth. Society's gaze was merciless. To appear blemished, flushed, ordinary, It was to invite whispers, to risk exclusion. Beauty was not merely vanity, it was survival. Yet as Margaret sat there staring into the flames, she felt the weariness seep deeper into her bones. A faint ringing in her ears grew louder, persistent. She pressed her fingers to her temples, trying to will it away. The powders had granted her triumph that day, but the cost was already being collected in silence. That night, Margaret dreamt again. Shadows moved through her sleep, whispers of women's voices calling faintly, their faces pale and cracked, their eyes hollow. They reached toward her, their hands dusted with the same white powder she wore, their lips painted red with vermilion. She woke with a start, her body clammy with sweat, her breath uneven. The candle by her bedside had long burned down to a stub, leaving only the scent of melted wax in the room. Anne rushed in, hearing her mistress stir. She offered water, which Margaret drank greedily, her hands still trembling. Yet even as Anne urged her to rest, Margaret's eyes turned toward the dressing table, to the rows of jars waiting patiently in the dim morning light. They seemed to glimmer, to beckon her. For Margaret, the choice was never truly a choice. The powders were both her prison and her salvation, and so, with each new dawn, the ritual would begin again. The days that followed seemed, at first glance, to flow as they always had in the Whitfield household. The routine of breakfast, the calls from acquaintances, the evening gatherings, and the endless cycle of maintaining appearances gave the impression of normalcy. Yet beneath the surface, beneath the quiet rustle of gowns and the polite tones of conversation, there was a slow unraveling that only those closest to Lady Margaret could sense. Anne, who had served her mistress faithfully for nearly a decade, noticed it most keenly. She saw the way Margaret's steps faltered ever so slightly as she crossed a room, the way her hands sometimes trembled as she lifted a cup, and the faintest delay in her responses during long conversations. These were not the marks of laziness or distraction, but of a body quietly struggling under the burden of its own adornments. On one particular morning, Margaret sat before the mirror, the curtains once again drawn to shield her from the unflattering glare of daylight. The powders awaited her, as they always did, their pale surfaces gleaming like sirens calling her to the ritual. Anne prepared them with quiet resignation, yet her hands shook as she lifted the brush. "Milady," Anne began cautiously, "there is talk in the city of women falling ill." Margaret arched a brow, glancing briefly at her maid through the reflection. "Ill? Women are always falling ill, Anne. It is the natural order of things." Anne pressed her lips together, but continued. "These are women of the gentry, milady. They say their skin breaks, their hair thins, their strength falters. Some whisper it is the paints, the powders." For a fleeting moment, Margaret's brush paused against her cheek. The thought lingered, heavy, unwelcome. But then she smiled faintly, the expression practiced, effortless. "Jealous rivals invent tales, Anne. They would rather see us hide our beauty than bask in admiration. Do not trouble yourself with gossip." Yet deep within, Margaret knew that Anne's words echoed whispers she herself had heard. A letter from her cousin spoke of a friend bedridden, her face scarred, her body weakened. Another acquaintance, once radiant, had withdrawn from society altogether. The reasons were never spoken aloud, but the silence carried its own kind of weight. That evening, Margaret and Lord Whitfield attended another gathering, this one at the grand home of the Carraways. The ballroom shimmered with candlelight and glittering jewels, the air thick with perfume and the faint smoke of cigars. Margaret entered with poise, her face once more a porcelain mask, her lips painted with careful precision. Compliments followed her like shadows. But as the night drew on, Margaret felt the edges of her strength falter. While dancing with Lord Whitfield, she felt her breath shorten, her chest tightening in a way she had never known. Her vision blurred for an instant, the chandeliers above her seeming to sway as though caught in a storm. She forced her body to remain upright, her smile intact, but Anne, watching from a distance, recognized the subtle tremor in her mistress's hand as she clutched her partner's arm. When the dance ended, Margaret excused herself, retreating to the side of the room. She pressed a handkerchief to her lips and when she pulled it away, there was the faintest trace of blood. She folded it quickly, hiding the evidence, her heart pounding with a fear she would not admit even to herself. Lord Whitfield approached, concern etched faintly across his features. "Are you unwell, Margaret?" She forced a smile. "Merely the heat of the room, my lord. Nothing more." He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded, satisfied by her composure. Yet Anne, who had hurried to her side, saw the truth. The paleness that lay beneath the powder was not the refined complexion of beauty, but the pallor of strain, of illness creeping quietly within. Back home, once the guests and carriages had faded into the night, Anne helped Margaret to her chambers. The moment the door closed, Margaret collapsed into the chair by the fire, her body trembling. Anne knelt beside her, loosening the gown, unfastening the corset, wiping gently at her face. Beneath the layers of powder, the sores had worsened, faint lesions tracing along her jaw and chin. Her lips, though still tinted with rouge, bore the rawness of irritation. "Milady," Anne whispered urgently, "this is not mere fatigue. You must see the physician." Margaret's eyes, heavy with exhaustion, met Anne's. For the first time, there was no practiced smile, no feigned indifference. "And what will he say, Anne? That I should strip myself of all that I am? That I should show my true face to the world and watch them recoil? No, I will not give them that satisfaction." Tears pricked at Anne's eyes, but she did not argue further. She wrapped a shawl around her mistress's shoulders and sat beside her until the trembling eased. Though the firelight revealed truths that could not be hidden, Lady Margaret was slipping, slowly, inevitably, into decline. In the days that followed, Margaret attempted to maintain her routine, but her strength waned. She spent longer hours in her chamber, sometimes rising only for the evening gatherings, her energy reserved for those fleeting moments of performance. Visitors continued to marvel at her appearance, unaware of the cost. They praised her complexion, her delicate beauty, while the poison seeped deeper, hollowing her from within. Anne noticed other changes, too. Margaret's moods shifted swiftly, from sharp irritation to quiet despair. She grew restless at night, pacing her chambers, murmuring to herself. At times, she stared at the mirror as though seeing not her own reflection, but something else, something darker, lingering behind the glass. One night, Anne awoke to the sound of movement. She hurried to Margaret's chamber and found her mistress seated before the mirror, the candlelight flickering across her pale features. The jars of powder lay scattered, some open, the contents spilled like dust across the table. Margaret's hands trembled as she dipped her fingers into the ceruse, smearing it across her cheeks in uneven strokes. "Milady," Anne whispered, stepping forward, "please, you must stop. You're hurting yourself." Margaret's eyes met hers in the mirror, wide, frantic. "Do you not see, Anne? Without this, I am nothing. Without this, I fade. They will not look at me. They will not remember me." Anne knelt beside her, grasping her trembling hands. "You are more than paint, more than powder. You are—" But Margaret pulled away, her face contorting in anguish. "No, you do not understand. This is not vanity. This is survival. They would rather I be beautiful and dying than plain and alive. That is the truth of our world." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the crackle of the candle flame. Anne wept quietly, her tears slipping down her cheeks as she watched her mistress. A woman trapped not only by the poisons she used, but by the invisible chains of expectation. Margaret turned back to the mirror, her reflection fractured by the uneven glass. She touched her face, now smeared and imperfect, yet still pale under the weight of lead. Her lips parted in a whisper that Anne barely heard. "If beauty is the price, then I shall pay it." And so the ritual continued. Day after day, night after night, each layer of powder a step further into the abyss. Society applauded, none the wiser, as Margaret's body quietly betrayed her. The whispers of gossip spread of her elegance, her grace, her delicate charm. But within the confines of her chamber, the truth grew harder to hide. Anne, loyal though powerless, bore witness to it all. She knew that the path her mistress walked had only one end, though neither dared to speak it aloud. and as the nights lengthened and the shadows deepened in the corners of the Whitfield home, the line between beauty and death blurred until it was no longer a line at all, but a mirror in which Lady Margaret gazed, seeing her reflection dissolve piece by piece. The autumn wind swept through London with a chill that carried more than just the bite of changing weather. It carried whispers, whispers of illness, of decline, of women whose beauty, once so admired, now faded behind closed doors. Yet, for Lady Margaret Whitfield, the whispers mattered less than the reflection she continued to face each morning. The mirror had become both her sanctuary and her tormentor. By candlelight, she sat before it, jars of powder and rouge scattered like soldiers awaiting command. Her fingers, slender but trembling, reached for the familiar brush. Anne watched in silence, her heart aching with each movement, knowing the poison in those jars was no less deadly than a dagger pressed to flesh. Margaret's face bore the marks of her struggle now. Beneath the careful layers of powder, her skin was mottled, scarred with sores that refused to heal. Her lips cracked easily, though the rouge disguised it. Her eyes, once bright, now carried a dullness, shadowed by fatigue. And yet, when the powders were applied, when the mask was complete, she seemed, if only for a moment, to transform. In that moment, she was still the lady society admired. She was still pale, refined, untouchable. She was still the woman others envied, the woman men praised. But the mask was becoming harder to maintain. One morning, as Anne dabbed powder onto her mistress's cheek, she could no longer contain herself. "Milady, please, this cannot go on. You are suffering more each day." Margaret's gaze shifted to the mirror, never meeting Anne's eyes. "And what choice have I? Do you wish me to step into society unpainted? To let them see the truth? I would be destroyed, Anne, stripped of dignity, stripped of worth." Anne's voice cracked with desperation. "But if you continue, you will have no life left to protect." For a long moment, silence filled the room. The crackle of the fire, the faint creak of the floorboards, the rustle of fabric as Margaret adjusted her gown. These sounds filled the space where words could not. Finally, Margaret whispered, "Better to die admired than to live forgotten." That evening, they attended yet another gathering, though Margaret's steps faltered as they descended the grand staircase. Lord Whitfield, ever the proud husband, offered his arm, his smile practiced for society's gaze. He, too, had noticed the changes in his wife, though he chose silence over confrontation. To him, as to so many, appearances mattered more than truths best left hidden. In the Caraway ballroom once again, the chandeliers sparkled, the music swelled, and the air hummed with the sound of laughter and conversation. Margaret entered like a figure carved of porcelain, her presence commanding attention. Compliments followed her, as they always did. Yet beneath the admiration, there was something else now, something unspoken, a flicker of pity in one woman's eyes, a faint hesitation in a gentleman's greeting. Margaret felt it, even if they tried to hide it. She felt their gazes lingering too long, their voices lowering as she passed. She knew the whispers had begun, not of her elegance, but of her frailty. Still, she smiled. Still, she danced. But halfway through the evening, as the violins swelled and couples spun across the polished floor, Margaret's strength failed her. Her vision swam, her knees buckled. She collapsed, her body crumpling against the floor, her gown spreading around her like fallen silk. Gasps filled the hall. Lord Whitfield rushed to her side, his face pale with shock, while servants hurried forward. Margaret's eyes fluttered open briefly. She forced a smile, whispering, "Just the heat." Nothing more. But the words were weak, barely audible. She was carried from the hall, her body light as though hollowed by the poisons within. Anne followed, her heart pounding, tears threatening to spill as she watched her mistress struggle to breathe. Back at the Whitfield home, physicians were finally summoned. They examined Margaret with grave expressions, their whispers urgent, their conclusions unspoken but heavy. Lord Whitfield pressed them for answers, but none dared speak the truth outright. Instead, they offered vague suggestions of rest, of reducing certain cosmetic indulgences. Margaret lay in her chamber, the curtains drawn, her body fragile beneath the weight of blankets. Anne sat beside her, holding her hand, watching as her mistress drifted in and out of uneasy sleep. In the quiet hours, Margaret would wake, her eyes glassy, her voice faint. "Anne," she whispered one night, Do you think they will remember me?" Anne squeezed her hand, her own tears spilling freely. "They will remember your kindness, milady. Your grace, your strength." Margaret's lips curved faintly, though her eyes remained distant. "No, they will remember my face. That is all they have ever cared for." Days stretched into weeks, and Margaret's decline became impossible to ignore. Her hair began to thin, strands falling upon her pillow. Her skin, once the canvas of endless powders, grew too fragile to bear them. Still, she insisted on the ritual, though Anne begged her to stop. Each morning, Anne applied the powders with trembling hands, knowing she was complicit in her mistress's destruction, yet powerless to refuse. Each evening, Margaret faced the mirror, her reflection both a comfort and a curse. Lord Whitfield grew distant, spending long hours away from the house. Society, once so eager to sing Margaret's praises, grew quieter, the invitations fewer. The whispers, however, grew louder. They spoke not of her beauty, but of her illness, her absence, her decline. One afternoon, Margaret sat by the window, the curtains parted slightly to let in the pale autumn light. Her face was painted, though faintly, for her skin could no longer bear the heavy powders. She gazed out at the street below, watching carriages pass, children dart between them, chimney smoke rising into the gray sky. "Anne," she murmured, "do you think the world would be different if beauty were not a woman's worth?" Anne, startled by the question, hesitated before answering. "Perhaps, milady, but perhaps not in our time." Margaret's eyes lingered on the world beyond the glass. "Then in another time, may women be free of this curse." Her words hung in the air, fragile and haunting. That night, Margaret dreamt again. She saw herself walking through a grand hall, her gown trailing behind her, the chandeliers above glowing brighter than the sun. People turned to watch, their eyes wide with admiration. But as she drew closer to them, their faces blurred, their gazes shifted, and their admiration twisted into horror. She looked down at her hands and saw them crumbling to dust, her skin flaking away like powder. She woke with a scream, her body drenched in sweat, Anne rushing to her side. The days ahead promised no respite. The poisons that had granted her beauty had claimed their price, and Margaret walked the thin line between illusion and truth, between life and the slow descent into shadow. And through it all, the mirror remained, reflecting not the woman she truly was, but the mask she could not relinquish. The winter that settled over London that year was particularly cruel. A damp chill clung to every street, every stone, and every soul that wandered through the fog. For Lady Margaret Whitfield, the cold was not merely in the air. It seeped into her bones, making each breath, each movement, a struggle against a body betraying her. Her chamber had become her world. The grand halls of the Whitfield estate echoed with silence now, for the mistress of the house no longer entertained. Invitations from society dwindled, and those that arrived were often tucked away, unread. The carriages that once rolled up the drive in a constant parade of visitors came less and less, until only the physician's carriage or the occasional concerned relation dared break the stillness. Anne remained faithfully at her side, though the strain on her was evident. Her hands, once quick and steady, often shook as she prepared the powders, though Margaret insisted upon them still. The ritual continued each morning, the mirror unveiled, the brushes arranged, the familiar dance of concealment and transformation. But the mask was cracking. Where once the powders had hidden blemishes, now they could not disguise the pallor of death that seemed to creep ever closer. Margaret's lips had lost their fullness, her eyes seemed sunken, and her once bright hair had thinned so dramatically that wigs were now required. Still she pressed forward, refusing to let the truth of her decline be seen, even by herself. One bleak morning, the frost heavy upon the window panes, Anne tried again to intervene. "Milady, please," she whispered, her voice breaking. "If you would only let the powders rest. Your skin is so fragile now, it cannot bear this any longer." Margaret's gaze never left the mirror. She lifted the brush herself, her hand trembling yet determined. "If I stop, Anne, then I am no longer Lady Whitfield. I am no longer anything." Her voice was thin, her words barely audible, yet the conviction in them was unshaken. The physicians, summoned more frequently now, spoke in hushed tones of systemic decline and poisonous saturation. Lord Whitfield, whose presence had grown sporadic, listened with a detached air, nodding gravely but offering little comfort to his wife. His visits to her chamber were brief, often perfunctory, as though her illness were a distasteful reminder of something he would rather not face. Anne, however, saw the truth up close. She saw the tremors in Margaret's hands, the way her breath grew shallow after the simplest tasks, the way her body wasted away, though her spirit clung desperately to the illusion of control. The dreams, too, returned with greater frequency. Margaret would wake in the night, gasping, clutching at her chest. She spoke of visions, of grand halls filled with faceless figures, of mirrors shattering into endless shards, of her own reflection dissolving into dust. Anne soothed her as best she could, though the dread in her mistress's eyes lingered long after the nightmares had passed. One evening, a small gathering was held in their home, arranged by Lord Whitfield in an effort to maintain appearances. Margaret insisted on attending, though her body was weak, her steps unsteady. Anne dressed her carefully, securing the wig, applying the powders with the gentlest of touches, though every motion seemed to pain her mistress. When Margaret descended the staircase, the guests below gasped softly. To them, she appeared pale but radiant, delicate as fine porcelain. Compliments were offered, polite and practiced, though whispers followed when they thought she could not hear. Margaret smiled as she always had, though the effort left her trembling. She spoke little, her voice faint, but her presence alone seemed to satisfy the expectations of society. Yet Anne saw the toll it took. By the end of the evening, Margaret collapsed once again, carried swiftly back to her chamber as the guests murmured in discomfort. Afterward, Lord Whitfield scolded Anne in private. "You must keep her from such displays. It is unbecoming." Anne, usually so deferential, finally snapped. "She is dying, my lord. And still she paints her face to please you, to please them. You should be at her side, not concerned with what is becoming." Lord Whitfield's face hardened, his pride wounded, but he offered no reply. The weeks dragged on. Margaret's body grew frailer, her world shrinking to the confines of her chamber and the mirror that still dominated her mornings. The powders now clung poorly to her skin. The rouge settled into lines carved by pain, and the wigs felt heavy upon her weakened frame. Yet she persisted. One afternoon, as snow fell softly outside, Margaret asked Anne to open the curtains wide. The pale light illuminated her face, unpainted for once, as she gazed into the mirror. Her reflection startled her. The woman staring back was not Lady Whitfield, admired and envied. She was hollow, broken, human. For the first time in months, Margaret let the powders rest. She sat in silence, tears slipping down her cheeks, as Anne quietly held her hand. "I have been a fool," Margaret whispered at last. "I traded life for the illusion of beauty, and now, even the illusion betrays me." Anne shook her head, her voice fierce through her tears. "You were not a fool, milady. You were trapped by their expectations, by their cruel standards. None of this was your fault." Margaret closed her eyes, the faintest smile curving her lips. "Perhaps, but it was my choice to obey them." That night, her dreams returned once more. She stood again in the grand hall, the chandeliers blazing. But this time, when she looked into the mirrors lining the walls, she saw not the painted mask, but her true face, worn, scarred, and fragile. And for the first time, she did not turn away. She woke with a strange calm, her body weak, but her spirit unburdened. She told Anne, "Tomorrow, no powders, no masks. Let them see me as I am." Anne's tears flowed freely, but she nodded. "As you wish, milady." The following day, Margaret sat before her mirror with her face bare. The scars, the pallor, the fragility, all were visible, undeniable, and yet, as she gazed at her reflection, she felt a flicker of peace. For the first time in years, she saw herself, not the illusion, not the mask, but the woman who had endured. Anne stood beside her, silent and steadfast. Lord Whitfield entered briefly, his expression unreadable, before leaving without a word. Margaret did not seem to mind. The snow fell steadily outside, blanketing the city in silence. In her chamber, Lady Margaret Whitfield faced the truth of her reflection at last. Her body failing, but her spirit finally free of the chains of false beauty. And though death loomed ever closer, she no longer feared it. For in the mirror, she no longer saw the mask of society's expectations. She saw herself, and that, at last, was enough. The frost outside had hardened into a brittle layer, cracking softly under the weight of passing carriages and boots. Within the Whitfield estate, however, the air was heavy with a different kind of chill, a chill born of isolation, fear, and the relentless march of time upon a body slowly giving way to the poisons it had long absorbed. Lady Margaret Whitfield sat in her chamber, the curtains drawn tightly to keep the pale winter light from her face, though it was impossible to hide entirely from the gaze of reality. Her reflection in the mirror was stark. The layers of powder that once concealed the truth now clung unevenly, settling into the fine lines etched by years of strain, fatigue, and chemical assault. Her cheeks, once rosy with vermilion, were now pale and mottled. Her lips, cracked and dry, bore only a faint tinge of color. Her eyes, tired and sunken, stared back at her with a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. Anne moved quietly, setting out the jars and brushes, though each motion was careful, deliberate, as though she feared disturbing the fragile composure of her mistress. Margaret's hands, thin and trembling, reached for the ceruse, applying it with meticulous care. Even in this weakened state, the ritual persisted, a testament to the hold that societal expectations held over her life. "Milady," Anne said softly, "perhaps today we might lessen the application. Your skin is—" Margaret cut her off with a faint shake of her head. "No, Anne, it must be done. Every morning, every day. It is not merely vanity. It is survival. If I falter, they will see the truth, and I will be nothing." Anne's eyes filled with tears. She had long known that resistance was futile. The powders were no longer merely adornment. They had become the very framework of Margaret's existence. To remove them would be to expose herself not only to society, but to the harsh awareness of her body's fragility. The morning passed with painstaking attention to each detail: the blending of powders, the subtle shading of rouge, the careful application of kohl around the eyes. Margaret's reflection transformed, but only marginally. The once fluid mask of porcelain now appeared fragile, brittle, almost like a delicate sculpture, at risk of crumbling under the slightest touch. By midday, the effects of the powders began to betray her. Her skin tingled painfully, the lesions beneath the surface aching with a persistent, gnawing fire. She pressed a hand to her cheek, inhaling sharply, yet forcing a small, dignified smile to the mirror as though no suffering existed. Anne moved to soothe her, applying damp cloths and whispering reassurances. But Margaret brushed them away with a quiet, imperious wave of her hand. The hours of the afternoon were spent in careful preparation for the evening's gathering, a private audience with a select group of influential ladies. Margaret knew that each visitor's eyes would measure her, not by her mind or her character, but by the perfection of her appearance. The pressure was immense, yet she faced it without faltering, even as her body betrayed her in the most subtle ways: a quickened heartbeat, a lightness in her limbs, a faint tremor in her fingers. As twilight approached, the carriage arrived. Margaret, dressed in a flowing gown of ivory silk, its surface adorned with intricate lace and delicate pearls, descended the staircase with Anne at her side. The powders held as well as they could, the faintest imperfections masked by strategic placement and meticulous brushing. Lord Whitfield's arm supported her gently, though the expression on his face betrayed a mixture of pride and unease. The gathering itself was a delicate dance of appearances. The room glowed with candlelight, casting shadows that softened flaws and highlighted elegance. Margaret moved among her guests, offering polite conversation, measured laughter, and gentle smiles. Compliments flowed freely, yet Anne noticed the subtle glances, the faint worry in certain eyes. They sensed the fragility behind the mask. Halfway through the evening, Margaret felt the first significant wave of dizziness. She steadied herself against the arm of a nearby chair, forcing a gentle laugh to mask the tremor that ran through her body. Anne, ever vigilant, moved discreetly to her side, offering silent support while maintaining the appearance of decorum. A few hours later, the gathering concluded. Margaret returned home, her body exhausted beyond measure. Anne assisted her to her chamber, easing her into a chair by the fire. The ritual of removing the powders was excruciating for both women. Margaret's skin bore the visible scars of repeated chemical assaults, open sores, inflammation, and faint bruising. Her lips were raw, and her eyes, though still alert, carried a shadow of deep fatigue. "Anne," Margaret whispered, her voice weak but resolute, Do you think they saw the truth tonight?" Anne shook her head, though her eyes betrayed the worry she could not voice. "No, milady. To them, you were as always, elegant, composed, radiant." Margaret allowed a faint, weary smile. "Then the mask has served its purpose, for another evening at least." The following nights were a repetition of the same exhausting cycle. The powders were applied each morning, each stroke a careful blend of concealment and illusion. Anne performed her duties with quiet desperation, knowing that each application shortened the fragile thread of life her mistress clung to. Margaret faced herself in the mirror, and though she glimpsed the truth of her body's decline, she could not bring herself to stop. Her dreams became increasingly vivid, almost prophetic. She saw herself wandering through halls lined with mirrors, the reflections multiplying endlessly. In each reflection, her appearance changed, sometimes beautiful, sometimes grotesque, sometimes fading entirely into the pale gray void of her mortality. She awoke gasping, heart pounding, sweat soaking her nightgown. Anne would rush to her side, calming her, but the visions left traces of unease that lingered throughout the day. Margaret began to experience moments of extreme weakness during her waking hours. She would sometimes collapse into a chair mid-conversation, her hands shaking violently, her vision blurring. These incidents became more frequent, though she persisted in attending small gatherings, refusing to allow her body's failings to betray her to society. The physicians, increasingly alarmed, attempted to intervene with a mixture of tact and urgency. They advised rest, reduction of chemical application, and a less strenuous schedule of social engagement. Margaret listened politely, acknowledging their words without ever conceding to them. Her dependence on the powders was absolute. Each day without them felt like a threat to her very identity. Anne, though aware of the danger, could do nothing but comply with the ritual, applying the powders with the gentlest touch, all the while watching her mistress's body deteriorate beneath the surface. One afternoon, as the snow fell thick and silent outside the windows, Margaret sat staring into the mirror for hours, her hands poised over the jars, but refusing to touch them. Anne knelt beside her, holding her hand, waiting. Finally, Margaret spoke, her voice barely audible. "Anne, if I stop, what becomes of me?" "You become yourself, milady," Anne replied softly, "and nothing else should matter." Margaret's gaze lingered on her reflection, the truth of her face revealed in stark, unforgiving clarity. The scars, the pallor, the signs of poisoning, all were visible. And yet, in that moment, she saw a strength she had never acknowledged, the resilience of a woman who had endured countless trials, not of her making, yet who had survived in spirit, if not in body. As night fell, Margaret finally let her hands rest. No powders were applied, no mask created. The mirror reflected her true self, frail and scarred, but undeniably present. Anne wept quietly beside her, tears of relief, grief, and love flowing freely. The winter deepened, and with it, Margaret's condition continued to decline. Yet amidst the physical suffering, a strange serenity began to settle over her. For the first time in years, she faced the world without illusion, and in doing so, discovered a kind of peace that no powder could ever provide. She whispered again to Anne in the quiet hours, "Perhaps this is what freedom feels like." Anne nodded, her hand clasping Margaret's tightly. "Yes, milady, freedom, at last." Outside, the frost glimmered in the moonlight. Untouched and indifferent while inside, Lady Margaret Whitfield faced her own reflection with courage. Her beauty now measured not in powders or pigments, but in endurance, resilience, and the quiet dignity of a life fully lived, however short it might be. The city outside London had grown quieter as winter deepened, the narrow streets slick with ice and the fog rolling heavier across the Thames. Within the Whitfield estate, the atmosphere was a mixture of oppressive cold and the ever-present tension of anticipation, as Lady Margaret Whitfield faced each day with a combination of ritualistic determination and an undercurrent of fragility that grew more evident with every passing hour. Her chamber, now more a sanctuary than a living space, had become cluttered with jars, brushes, and powders, each placed meticulously by Anne. The mirror dominated the room, reflecting the thin, trembling figure of Margaret as she moved with deliberate care. Though the powders were applied daily, the transformation they once granted had begun to falter. The layers, now less forgiving, highlighted the flaws they were meant to conceal. The paleness, the fine scars, the sagging of her cheeks, all betrayed the truth beneath the facade of refinement. Margaret rose slowly that morning, her movements hesitant, each step calculated to preserve the illusion of strength. Anne, her faithful maid, observed quietly, offering assistance only when necessary. The air was thick with an unspoken understanding. The ritual must continue, regardless of the cost. For appearances in society mattered more than the fragile body beneath. "Anne," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse, "prepare the powders. Every morning must be as perfect as the last." Anne hesitated, the weight of her own anxiety heavy upon her. "Milady, perhaps a lighter hand today? Your skin, it is so delicate now." Margaret's eyes met hers in the mirror, fierce and unyielding. "Delicate? Yes, but we cannot let the world see weakness. Do you understand? Appearances must be preserved, even if it is the last thing I do." And so the ritual commenced. Anne applied the ceruse with painstaking care, blending it to cover blemishes that grew daily more visible, her hands shaking as she worked. Margaret, though frail, maintained an unwavering composure, her face transformed into the illusion of youth and perfection, a mask that belied the suffering it concealed. By midday, her strength was already waning. Every step was measured, every gesture deliberate, and every word weighed with effort. Anne watched closely, noting the subtle tremors in her mistress's hands, the slight wobble of her knees, the shallow rhythm of her breath. The powders had become both shield and shackle, granting fleeting beauty while accelerating the decay beneath. The afternoon was spent preparing for a small gathering of influential acquaintances. Margaret insisted on attending despite her weakening body. Her gown of deep sapphire, trimmed with silver embroidery, fell elegantly around her, yet every movement required precision and support. Anne assisted in the final touches, arranging her hair and applying the last touches of rouge, her own heart heavy with apprehension. The carriage arrived as scheduled, and Margaret, supported by Anne and Lord Whitfield, descended the staircase. The eyes of society were upon her, measuring every detail, noting every imperfection. Yet Margaret presented herself with the composure of a practiced aristocrat. Compliments followed in measured tones. Yet the observant Anne could sense the subtle glances that hinted at concern, pity, or speculation. The gathering itself was a carefully choreographed dance of etiquette and appearance. Margaret moved gracefully among her guests, offering smiles, gentle conversation, and laughter that rang soft yet precise. Each gesture required extraordinary effort. Each smile was a battle against the frailty of her body. As the evening progressed, Margaret's condition deteriorated visibly. The heat of the room and the exertion required to maintain her presence became increasingly taxing. Her knees trembled, her hands shook, and her vision occasionally blurred. She masked these symptoms with the practiced poise of an experienced socialite, yet Anne, watching from a discreet distance, recognized the signs of true suffering. By the time the evening concluded, Margaret could scarcely stand. Anne guided her to the carriage with gentle hands, supporting her mistress with the utmost care. Once home, Margaret was carried to her chamber, where the powders were removed with slow, deliberate motions. Beneath the layers, her skin bore the unmistakable marks of repeated chemical exposure: sores, inflammation, and patches of irritation. Her lips were cracked and raw, and her eyes, though still holding defiance, reflected exhaustion and pain. "Anne," Margaret whispered, her voice faint. "Did I maintain the illusion?" Anne, tears welling in her eyes, nodded. "Yes, milady, you were as society expects, elegant and graceful." Margaret allowed a faint, weary smile. "Then it has served its purpose, for another evening at least." The following days followed a pattern that had become tragically familiar. Each morning the powders were applied, each stroke a careful effort to maintain the illusion. Anne performed her duties with quiet resignation, knowing that each application was contributing to the further deterioration of her mistress's fragile body. Margaret faced the mirror, seeing the truth of her appearance reflected in stark clarity, yet she persisted, unwilling to relinquish the mask that defined her existence. Her dreams grew darker and more vivid. She wandered through endless halls lined with mirrors, each reflection presenting a variation of her face, youthful and perfect, aged and scarred, sometimes grotesque and decayed. She awoke in the night, gasping, drenched in sweat, with Anne rushing to her side to soothe her trembling body. Margaret's physical condition declined steadily. She experienced frequent bouts of weakness, collapsing into chairs, her hands shaking uncontrollably, her vision blurred. These incidents became more frequent, yet she continued to attend small social gatherings, her resolve unwavering even as her body betrayed her. The physicians, alarmed by the persistent deterioration, advised restraint and rest. They cautioned against continued use of the powders, emphasizing the toll they were taking. Margaret listened politely, acknowledging their advice without conceding, her resolve rooted in the fear of being seen as ordinary, vulnerable, or flawed. Anne, witnessing the relentless toll, begged for moderation. "Milady, for the sake of your health, please consider." Margaret interrupted, her voice steady, though strained. "No, Anne, the world measures me by what it sees. Without this I am nothing. Even as I weaken, I must maintain the illusion. This is my choice, and it is my only defense." Night after night, the cycle continued. The powders, the creams, the careful arrangements of hair and garments, all persisted despite the unmistakable toll on her body. Anne moved quietly beside her, offering support, administering care, and silently bearing witness to the slow erosion of her mistress's strength. One particularly harsh evening, as snow fell thick and relentless outside, Margaret faced herself in the mirror for hours. Her reflection was frail, scarred, and pale, yet she clung to the ritual. Anne knelt beside her, holding her hand and offering whispered reassurances. "Milady, look at yourself," Anne urged softly. "See beyond the powders. See the woman you are, resilient and enduring." Margaret's gaze lingered on her reflection, the truth undeniable. She saw the fragile skin, the hollowness in her cheeks, the deep shadows beneath her eyes. And yet, she also recognized a strength forged through years of societal expectation, endurance, and determination. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Perhaps, tomorrow I shall see myself without the mask. Perhaps I shall face the world as I am." Anne's tears flowed freely, relief and grief mingling as she clasped her mistress's hand. "Yes, milady, face the world as you are, for there is courage in truth." The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing London in quiet serenity. Within the Whitfield estate, Lady Margaret Whitfield confronted her reflection with newfound clarity. The powders remained, yet for the first time, she glimpsed the possibility of freedom beyond the mask. A freedom that, though fragile, promised a measure of peace her body had long been denied. The days grew colder, the wind harsher, cutting through the streets of London with a sharpness that seemed to mirror the state of Lady Margaret Whitfield's own fragile body. Within the walls of the Whitfield estate, however, a different kind of chill prevailed. The quiet, suffocating tension of decline, the slow erosion of strength masked by relentless ritual. Margaret's chamber had become both sanctuary and prison. The mirror, once a source of pride and meticulous self-assessment, now reflected a woman who bore the visible consequences of a life devoted to illusion. The powders, once capable of concealing minor imperfections, clung unevenly, highlighting blemishes, scars, and the pallor that had become her constant companion. Yet despite the frailty of her body, she persisted, clinging to the rituals that defined her existence. Anne moved quietly beside her, preparing the powders with a care born of both devotion and dread. Her hands trembled as she lifted each brush, knowing the cost of each application. She watched Margaret's delicate movements, the faint tremors in her fingers, the subtle faltering of her breath, yet the mistress of the house remained resolute. "Anne," Margaret whispered, her voice hoarse, "we cannot falter now. Every morning must be as precise as the last. Every evening, every gathering. Appearances are all that remain." Anne swallowed, tears welling in her eyes. "Milady, surely a gentler hand, a lighter touch." "Your body." Margaret's gaze was fixed on the mirror, fierce and unwavering. "Do you not understand? To falter is to vanish. The world measures me by what it sees. Without the mask, I am nothing." The ritual commenced, slow and deliberate. Anne applied ceruse and rouge, her movements careful, delicate, as if afraid of the fragile body before her. Margaret's reflection transformed into an illusion of youth and perfection, but the cracks beneath the surface were undeniable. The once fluid mask of porcelain now seemed brittle, fragile, as if a single touch might shatter it entirely. By midday, her strength had waned noticeably. Every gesture required extraordinary effort. Every step was deliberate and every word measured. Anne observed the subtle tremors in Margaret's hands, the slight wobble of her knees, the shallow rhythm of her breath. Each application of the powders, though intended to preserve beauty, accelerated the deterioration of her body. Preparations for the evening's gathering consumed the remainder of the afternoon. Margaret, despite her weakening frame, insisted upon attending. Her gown of emerald silk, trimmed with silver lace, flowed around her, though each movement required care and support. Anne assisted with hair and makeup, applying the powders with painstaking precision. The mask was complete, but only just. The carriage arrived promptly, and Margaret descended the staircase with Lord Whitfield at her side. The eyes of society measured her, noting the precision of her appearance, the elegance of her movements. Compliments flowed, though Anne detected the faint glances of concern and speculation among the guests. They recognized the fragility masked by perfection. Throughout the evening, Margaret moved with careful grace, offering polite conversation, soft laughter, and measured smiles. Each step, each gesture was a battle against the weaknesses that gnawed at her body. The powders masked the flaws temporarily, yet Anne knew that each hour of exposure further taxed her mistress's frail condition. By the end of the evening, Margaret's body could barely endure. She trembled as she was guided to the carriage, collapsing into her chamber upon return. Anne removed the powders with painstaking care, revealing the undeniable signs of decline: inflamed skin, raw lips, sunken eyes. Margaret's strength had diminished further, yet her spirit clung to the illusion she had maintained for so long. "Anne, did they see me as I wished?" she whispered, voice weak, eyes glassy. Anne nodded, tears brimming. "Yes, milady, you were everything society desired. Graceful, elegant, radiant." Margaret allowed a faint smile, though it carried the weight of exhaustion. Then it has served its purpose. For another evening. The nights were haunted by vivid dreams. She wandered through endless halls lined with mirrors, each reflection revealing a different aspect of herself. Youth, decay, perfection, frailty. The visions left her gasping, sweating, and trembling. Anne would calm her, offering comfort as best she could, yet the unease lingered through the day. Physical weakness grew steadily. Margaret collapsed into chairs, trembled during conversations, and experienced frequent episodes of lightheadedness. Still, she attended gatherings, her resolve unwavering. The physicians, alarmed, implored her to rest, to limit the use of powders. Margaret listened politely but never conceded. Anne begged her to consider moderation. "Milady, for your health, for your life." Margaret interrupted softly but firmly. "No, Anne. Without the mask, I am nothing. Even as my body betrays me, I must maintain the illusion. It is my choice and my only defense." Each morning, the powders were applied with painstaking precision. Each stroke preserved the fragile illusion, yet also inflicted further damage. Anne moved silently, her heart heavy with the knowledge of the toll. Margaret faced the mirror, seeing the stark truth of her body's decline, yet persisted, unwilling to relinquish the mask. One snowy afternoon, Margaret finally paused before the mirror for hours. Her reflection revealed the full cost of years of chemical abuse, scars, pallor, fragile skin. Anne knelt beside her, holding her hand, whispering reassurances. "Look beyond the powders, milady. See yourself?" Anne urged softly. "See the resilience, the courage, the endurance." Margaret's eyes lingered on her reflection. The scars, the frailty, the shadows beneath her eyes, they were undeniable. And yet, amidst the pain, she recognized the strength she had cultivated over years of endurance. Finally she spoke. "Tomorrow, I shall face myself without the mask. I shall face the world as I am." Anne's tears flowed freely, a mix of relief, grief, and hope. "Yes, milady, face the world as you are, and let truth guide you." The winter outside continued to fall, blanketing London in silence. Within the Whitfield estate, Lady Margaret Whitfield confronted her reflection with courage. The powders remained, but she glimpsed the possibility of freedom. Freedom from illusion, from societal expectation, from the relentless demand for perfection. In that fragile peace, she discovered a quiet dignity that no chemical could ever grant. The streets of London were almost deserted as winter tightened its grip. Snow clung to rooftops, the fog rolled thickly along the riverbanks, and the chill seeped into every corner of the city. Within the Whitfield estate, however, a different storm raged, a storm of ritual, fear, and the slow decay of a woman whose life had become bound by both her beauty and the chemicals she used to preserve it. Lady Margaret. Whitfield sat before her mirror as the first light of dawn filtered through the frost-laden windows. The jars of powders and creams were arranged with meticulous precision, each one in its proper place. Anne moved quietly, preparing the day's application, her hands trembling slightly as she lifted the delicate brushes. Margaret's frailty was now unmistakable, yet the ritual persisted without pause. "Anne," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible, "do not let the world see weakness. Every morning, every brushstroke. It must be perfect." Anne swallowed hard. "Milady, perhaps today we could ease the pressure? Your skin is raw, fragile." Margaret's gaze hardened in the mirror, her eyes meeting her reflection with unwavering intensity. "Fragile? Yes, but that is not a reason to surrender. Appearances define us, Anne. Without them, I am nothing." The routine began. Anne applied the powders with painstaking care, the strokes slow, deliberate, and exact. Margaret's reflection transformed, yet the illusion was fragile. The once flawless mask now revealed subtle imperfections. Discoloration beneath the surface, tiny scars from repeated chemical applications, the pallor of a body under siege. Yet she persisted, every movement executed with extraordinary discipline. By late morning, Margaret's body began to betray her further. Her hands trembled, Her knees faltered and her breath grew shallow. Anne noted each symptom, her heart heavy with dread. The powders, which had long been both armor and weapon, now threatened to destroy the very woman they were meant to protect. The afternoon was spent preparing for a small, private gathering of influential women. Margaret insisted on attending, despite her weakening frame. Her gown, a deep crimson trimmed with black lace, flowed elegantly, though every step required careful guidance. Anne applied the final touches of makeup, her movements precise and tender, knowing the toll each brushstroke took on Margaret's frail skin. The carriage arrived, and Margaret descended the grand staircase with Lord Whitfield at her side. The eyes of society were upon her, noting every detail, every gesture. Compliments were offered, though Anne perceived the subtle glances of concern, pity, and curiosity among the guests. They recognized the fragility beneath the mask, even if they did not dare acknowledge it openly. Throughout the evening, Margaret moved with careful grace, her words measured, her laughter soft and deliberate. Each interaction was an exertion of willpower against the relentless weakening of her body. The powders masked her flaws temporarily, yet Anne knew that the price of each hour in society was immense. By nightfall, Margaret could scarcely endure. She trembled as she returned home, supported by Anne and Lord Whitfield, and was carried to her chamber. The removal of the powders revealed the unmistakable signs of her deterioration: inflamed skin, raw lips, sunken eyes, and the faint sheen of fever on her pale complexion. Anne. "Did they believe the illusion?" she whispered, voice weak. Anne nodded, tears streaming. "Yes, milady. To them you were perfect, elegant, radiant." Margaret allowed a faint smile, though her exhaustion was evident. Then the mask has served its purpose for another evening. The nights that followed were haunted by vivid dreams. Margaret wandered through endless halls lined with mirrors, each reflection presenting a different aspect of her face. Flawless, decayed, youthful, frail, grotesque, and finally, disappearing entirely into a void. She awoke gasping, sweating, and trembling, with Anne beside her, offering quiet comfort. Her physical weakness intensified. She collapsed into chairs, faltered during conversations, and experienced frequent lightheadedness. Still, she attended gatherings, driven by the unyielding demand of appearances. The physicians, alarmed by her decline, advised restraint, emphasizing the danger of continued chemical use. Margaret listened politely, yet never relented. Anne pleaded for moderation. "Milady, your life—" Margaret interrupted softly but firmly. "Anne, without the mask, I am nothing. Even as my body fails, I must persist. It is my choice, my only defense." Each morning, the powders were applied with painstaking precision, preserving the fragile illusion while accelerating the deterioration beneath. Anne moved silently, her heart heavy with each stroke. Margaret faced the mirror, acknowledging the truth of her body's decline, yet unable to relinquish the mask that defined her. One snowy afternoon, Margaret paused before the mirror for hours. Her reflection revealed the full cost of years of chemical use: scars, pallor, fragile skin. Anne knelt beside her, holding her hand, whispering reassurances. "Look beyond the powders, milady," Anne urged softly. "See yourself, resilient, courageous, enduring." Margaret's gaze lingered on her reflection. The frailty, the scars, the shadows beneath her eyes, unmistakable. Yet amidst the suffering, she recognized the strength she had cultivated over years of endurance. Finally, she spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "Tomorrow, I shall face myself without the mask. I shall confront the world as I truly am." Anne's tears flowed freely, relief and grief mingling, as she clasped her mistress's hand. "Yes, milady, face the world as you are, and let truth guide you." The snow continued to blanket London in silence. Within the Whitfield estate, Lady Margaret Whitfield confronted her reflection with courage. The powders remained, yet she glimpsed the possibility of freedom. Freedom from illusion, from societal expectation, from the relentless demand for perfection. In that fragile peace, she discovered a quiet dignity that no chemical could grant. The winter of that year seemed endless. London was a city of pale fog, slick streets, and the quiet hush of snow that muted the usual clamor of carriages, street cries, and market chatter. Within the Whitfield estate, the air was heavy not only with the chill, but with the persistent weight of expectation, ritual, and the slow unraveling of a woman whose life had been consumed by the pursuit of perfection. Lady Margaret Whitfield sat before her mirror as the first rays of dawn filtered through frost-laden windows. The jars of powders, creams, and pigments were arranged with meticulous precision. Anne moved silently, her hands trembling as she lifted each delicate brush. Margaret's body had become unmistakably frail, yet the ritual persisted without interruption. "Anne," Margaret whispered, her voice thin and hoarse, "we cannot falter. Every morning, every brushstroke, it must be flawless." Anne hesitated, worry etched across her face. "Milady, perhaps today. We could ease the ritual. Your skin is raw, delicate." Margaret's gaze hardened in the mirror. Her eyes, sharp and unyielding despite the exhaustion in her face, met Anne's. "Fragile? Yes, but surrender is not an option. The world judges me by what it sees. Without this mask, I am nothing." The ritual began. Anne applied the powders with painstaking care, each stroke deliberate, precise, and tender. Margaret's reflection transformed, yet the illusion was increasingly fragile. The once perfect mask now revealed faint imperfections, scars beneath the surface, discolorations, pallor creeping through the layers of ceruse and rouge. Yet she persisted, each motion executed with unwavering discipline. By late morning, Margaret's body betrayed her further. Her hands trembled, knees wobbled, and her breathing became shallow and uneven. Anne observed every subtle sign of distress, her heart heavy with fear. The powders, intended to preserve beauty, now threatened the very woman beneath them. Preparation for the evening's gathering consumed the afternoon. Margaret, despite her weakening frame, insisted on attending. Her gown, a rich sapphire trimmed with intricate silver lace, flowed elegantly around her, though each step required precision and careful support. Anne applied the final touches, her hands careful not to aggravate the fragile skin, knowing the immense cost of every stroke. The carriage arrived promptly, and Margaret descended the staircase with Lord Whitfield at her side. The eyes of society measured her, noting every detail of her appearance, every motion, and every gesture. Compliments were offered, soft and polite, yet Anne sensed the glances of concern and subtle whispers that acknowledged the fragility beneath the mask. Throughout the evening, Margaret moved with deliberate grace, offering gentle conversation and measured smiles. Each interaction demanded enormous exertion, every movement a battle against the relentless weakening of her body. The powders masked her flaws temporarily, yet Anne knew the price she paid for each moment of societal approval. By nightfall, Margaret could barely endure. She trembled as she returned home, supported by Anne and Lord Whitfield, and was carried to her chamber. The removal of the powders revealed the unmistakable signs of deterioration: inflamed skin, raw lips, sunken eyes, and faint fevers on her pale, fragile complexion. "Anne, did they believe the illusion?" she whispered, voice fragile, eyes glassy. Anne nodded, tears welling. "Yes, milady. To them you were perfection itself, elegant, composed, radiant." Margaret allowed a faint, weary smile, though exhaustion was evident. "Then the mask has served for another evening." Her nights were haunted by vivid, tormenting dreams. She wandered through endless halls lined with mirrors, each reflection showing a different version of herself. Flawless, decayed, youthful, frail, grotesque, and sometimes disappearing into a pale void. She awoke gasping, trembling, drenched in sweat, with Anne beside her, offering silent comfort. Margaret's physical weakness intensified steadily. Collapses into chairs became more frequent. Tremors and fainting spells occurred during conversations and movements. Yet she continued to attend gatherings, compelled by the unyielding demands of appearances. Physicians, alarmed by the decline, urged restraint, emphasizing the danger of continued chemical use. Margaret listened politely, yet never relinquished control of her mask. Anne pleaded for moderation. "Milady, for your health, your life," Margaret interrupted firmly, yet softly. "Anne, without the mask, I am nothing. Even as my body betrays me, I must persist. It is my choice, my defense." Each morning, powders were applied meticulously, preserving the fragile illusion while simultaneously eroding her body. Anne moved silently, bearing witness to the slow decline. Margaret faced her reflection, acknowledging the stark reality, yet unable to abandon the mask that had defined her existence for so many years. One snow-covered afternoon, Margaret paused before the mirror for hours. Her reflection revealed the full consequences of chemical use: scars, pallor, and fragile, almost translucent skin. Anne knelt beside her, holding her hand, whispering comfort and encouragement. "Look beyond the powders, milady," Anne urged softly. "See yourself, resilient, courageous, enduring." Margaret's eyes lingered on her reflection. The frailty, the scars, and the shadows under her eyes were undeniable. Yet within that suffering, she recognized a strength cultivated over years of relentless endurance and societal expectation. Finally, she spoke in a barely audible whisper. "Tomorrow, I shall face the world without the mask. I shall see myself, and be seen as I truly am." Anne's tears flowed freely, relief mingled with grief. "Yes, milady, face the world as you are, and let truth guide you." The winter outside continued, snow blanketing London in silence. Within the Whitfield estate, Lady Margaret Whitfield confronted her reflection with courage and newfound clarity. The powders remained, but she glimpsed freedom, the freedom from illusion, societal expectation, and the relentless pursuit of perfection. In that fragile peace, she discovered a quiet dignity no chemical could ever grant. The winter fog lay thick over London, wrapping the city in a muted gray shroud. The streets glistened with ice, and the sound of distant carriage wheels echoed faintly through the empty thoroughfares. Within the Whitfield estate, however, a different kind of tension lingered, quiet, relentless, and ever-present. Lady Margaret Whitfield's life had become a delicate balance of appearances, ritual, and the slow erosion of her body, a struggle that was both private and inexorably public in its consequences. Margaret sat before her mirror as the first weak light of dawn filtered through frost-streaked windows. The array of powders, creams, and brushes lay neatly arranged on the dressing table. Anne moved with quiet reverence, her hands trembling as she prepared each instrument for the morning ritual. Margaret's body had become frail, her movements increasingly deliberate. But the ritual persisted, as though any deviation might shatter the fragile structure of her identity. "Anne," Margaret whispered, her voice weak but firm, "we cannot falter today. Each brushstroke must be precise, each layer applied with perfection. Appearances define me. Without them, I cease to exist." Anne hesitated, worry evident in her expression. "Milady, your skin, it is raw, inflamed. Perhaps a lighter touch?" Margaret's eyes, sharp despite fatigue, met Anne's in the mirror. "Fragile? Yes, but surrender is not an option. The world sees only the surface, and I must present perfection, even as my body fails. This is not vanity, it is survival." The ritual began in earnest. Anne applied the ceruse and rouge with meticulous care. Each stroke was deliberate, every movement controlled. Margaret's reflection transformed, but the illusion was increasingly precarious. Subtle imperfections, the faint scars, the discoloration beneath the powders, the pallor creeping through the layers, hinted at the fragile truth beneath the mask. Yet Margaret maintained her composure, each movement executed with extraordinary discipline. By mid-morning, her body betrayed her further. Her hands shook, her knees wobbled, and her breathing grew shallow. Anne observed these signs closely, her heart heavy with fear. The powders that were intended to conceal imperfection had become instruments of harm, each application accelerating the deterioration of her delicate frame. The afternoon was devoted to preparing for a private gathering of prominent ladies. Margaret insisted on attending, despite her evident weakness. Her gown, a deep violet trimmed with intricate black lace, flowed gracefully, though every step required careful guidance. Anne applied the final touches, mindful of Margaret's delicate condition, knowing that each brushstroke, while preserving the mask of beauty, inflicted further damage. When the carriage arrived, Margaret descended the grand staircase, supported by Lord Whitfield. The eyes of society were upon her, measuring every detail, every gesture. Compliments flowed, soft and polite. Yet Anne could sense the subtle glances, the quiet exchanges of concern, that acknowledged the fragility behind the mask. During the gathering, Margaret moved with deliberate grace, offering soft conversation, gentle laughter, and measured smiles. Each interaction demanded enormous exertion, each gesture a battle against the relentless weakening of her body. The powders concealed her flaws temporarily, yet Anne knew that the toll of each hour in society was immense. By nightfall, Margaret could barely stand. She trembled as she returned home, supported by Anne and Lord Whitfield, and was carried to her chamber. The powders were removed with painstaking care, revealing the unmistakable signs of deterioration: inflamed, scarred skin, cracked lips, sunken eyes, and a faint, almost imperceptible fever. Despite her physical decline, her spirit clung stubbornly to the illusion she had so long cultivated. Anne, did they perceive me as I wished? She whispered, her voice thin, almost a sigh. Anne nodded, tears welling. Yes, milady. To them, you were everything society desires. Elegant, graceful, radiant. Margaret allowed a faint, weary smile. Then it has served its purpose, for another evening. Her nights were haunted by vivid, unsettling dreams. She wandered through endless halls lined with mirrors, each reflection showing a different version of herself. Flawless, aged, decayed, frail, grotesque, and sometimes fading entirely into an indistinct void. She awoke gasping, drenched in sweat, trembling with the weight of her own mortality, Anne at her side offering gentle comfort. Her physical weakness increased steadily. Collapses into chairs became frequent, tremors occurred during conversation and movement, and episodes of fainting threatened her presence in society. Yet she persisted, attending gatherings, compelled by the unyielding standards of appearances. Physicians, alarmed, urged moderation, warning of the dangers of continued chemical use. Margaret listened politely, yet her resolve never faltered. Anne pleaded with her. "Milady, for the sake of your health," Margaret interrupted softly but firmly. "Without the mask, I am nothing. Even as my body betrays me, I must continue. It is my choice and my only defense." Each morning, powders were applied meticulously. Every stroke preserved the fragile illusion, while simultaneously undermining the physical body beneath. Anne moved silently, her heart heavy with each brushstroke. Margaret faced her reflection, fully aware of the truth, yet unable to relinquish the mask that had defined her identity for decades. One snowy afternoon, Margaret paused before the mirror for hours. Her reflection revealed the full consequences of years of chemical use: scars, pallor, fragile, almost translucent skin. Anne knelt beside her, holding her hand, whispering reassurance and comfort. "See beyond the powders, milady," Anne said softly. "See the strength, the courage, the endurance." Margaret's gaze lingered on her reflection. The frailty, the scars, the shadows beneath her eyes, they were undeniable. Yet within the suffering, she recognized the strength that had been cultivated through years of perseverance and societal expectation. Finally, she whispered, "Tomorrow, I shall face myself without the mask. I shall meet the world as I truly am." Anne's tears flowed freely, relief and grief mingling together. "Yes, milady, face the world as you are, and let truth guide you." Outside, the winter snow continued to fall, blanketing London in quiet serenity. Inside the Whitfield estate, Lady Margaret Whitfield confronted her reflection with courage, clarity, and an emerging peace. The powders remained, yet she glimpsed freedom. The freedom from societal expectation, the freedom from illusion, and the freedom from the relentless pursuit of perfection. In that fragile peace, she discovered a dignity that no powder or chemical could ever grant. The chill of late winter had taken hold over London, its fog thick and relentless. The the streets silent save for the occasional clatter of distant carriages. Within the Whitfield estate, the atmosphere was heavy, layered with the weight of ritual, the echoes of societal expectation, and the slow, relentless decline of Lady Margaret Whitfield's body. Each day was a careful orchestration of appearance and endurance, a delicate dance between illusion and fragility. Margaret sat before her mirror as the first light of morning filtered through frost-lined windows. The powders, creams, and brushes lay meticulously arranged on the dressing table, each one a tool in the elaborate theater she performed daily. Anne moved quietly beside her, preparing each element with care, knowing that each brushstroke, each application, carried consequences for her mistress's fragile health. "Anne," Margaret whispered, her voice thin but resolute. "Today, more than ever, we must not falter. Every detail must be perfect, every brushstroke precise. Without this, I am nothing." Anne's hands trembled slightly as she lifted a brush. "Milady, your skin, it is raw, inflamed. Perhaps a gentler application today?" Margaret's gaze met hers in the mirror, unwavering, fierce. "Fragile? Yes, but surrender is not permitted. The world sees only what is presented, and I must present perfection. It is not vanity, it is survival." The ritual began with painstaking precision. Anne applied ceruse and rouge carefully, deliberately, ensuring each stroke enhanced the illusion while minimizing additional harm. Margaret's reflection transformed, yet the mask was increasingly precarious. Tiny scars, subtle discolorations, and the pallor of her weakened body were barely concealed beneath the layers of powder. Despite this, Margaret maintained her composure, each motion executed with extraordinary care. By late morning, Margaret's body betrayed her further. Her hands shook slightly, her knees faltered, and her breathing grew shallow. Anne observed these signs with a heart heavy with worry. The powders that once preserved beauty now accelerated the deterioration of her delicate frame. Each application, though intended to protect, became an act of self-sacrifice. Preparations for the day's private gathering occupied the afternoon. Margaret insisted on attending, despite her visible weakness. Her gown, a deep burgundy with black lace trim, flowed gracefully, but every step required careful support. Anne applied the final touches, her hands careful not to aggravate the fragile skin, aware of the delicate balance between beauty and bodily harm. The carriage arrived promptly, and Margaret descended the staircase with Lord Whitfield at her side. Eyes in society measured her, noting every detail, every gesture. Compliments were exchanged, polite and measured. Yet Anne perceived the subtle glances, the whispered observations that acknowledged the fragility masked beneath elegance. During the gathering, Margaret moved with careful grace, offering conversation, smiles, and laughter measured and soft. Each interaction demanded enormous exertion, every gesture a battle against her weakening body. The powders concealed flaws temporarily, yet Anne knew the price she paid for every hour in society's gaze. By nightfall, Margaret could barely remain upright. She trembled as she returned home, supported by Anne and Lord Whitfield, and was carried to her chamber. The removal of powders revealed unmistakable signs of her deterioration. Inflamed, scarred skin, cracked lips, sunken eyes, and faint fever, yet her spirit clung stubbornly to the mask she had maintained for decades. "Anne, did they see me as I wished?" she whispered, weak and trembling. Anne nodded, tears welling. "Yes, milady, to them you were perfection, elegant, graceful, radiant." Margaret allowed a faint smile, weary but resolute. "Then it has served for another evening." Nights were haunted by dreams, dark, vivid, and unrelenting. Endless halls lined with mirrors reflected countless versions of herself, youthful, decayed, frail, grotesque, disappearing into voids of shadow. She awoke gasping, drenched in sweat, trembling, with Anne at her side offering quiet comfort. Physical weakness intensified. Collapses into chairs became frequent, tremors more pronounced, and fainting threatened her presence in society. Yet she continued to attend gatherings, compelled by societal expectation. Physicians, alarmed, urged restraint, warning of the dangers of continued chemical use. Margaret listened politely, but never relented. Anne pleaded. "Milady, your life." Margaret interrupted softly yet firmly. "Without the mask, I am nothing. Even as my body betrays me, I must persist. It is my choice and my only defense." Each morning, powders were applied meticulously. Every stroke preserved the fragile illusion while simultaneously eroding her body. Anne moved silently, witnessing the slow decline. Margaret faced her reflection, acknowledging the stark truth, yet unable to relinquish the mask that had defined her for decades. One snowy afternoon, Margaret paused before the mirror for hours. Her reflection revealed the consequences of years of chemical use: scars, pallor, fragile skin almost translucent under the powders. Anne knelt beside her, holding her hand, whispering comfort and reassurance. "See beyond the powders, milady," Anne said softly. "See the strength, the courage, the endurance you have cultivated." Margaret's eyes lingered on her reflection. The frailty, the scars, the shadows beneath her eyes, indisputable. Yet within the suffering, she recognized the strength forged through years of perseverance and societal expectation. Finally, she whispered, "Tomorrow, I shall face myself without the mask. I shall meet the world as I am." Anne's tears flowed freely, relief and grief mingled. "Yes, milady, face the world as you are, and let truth guide you." The winter outside continued, snow blanketing London in muted silence. Within the Whitfield estate, Lady Margaret confronted her reflection with clarity and courage. The powders remained, yet she glimpsed freedom. The freedom from illusion, societal expectation, and relentless pursuit of perfection. In that fragile peace, she discovered a quiet dignity no chemical could ever grant. The heavy silence of winter enveloped London, a city draped in fog and snow, the cobblestone streets gleaming slick beneath the pale, muted light of morning. The chill penetrated every corner, chilling the bones of those who dared to wander the quiet avenues. Yet within the Whitfield estate, another kind of chill prevailed, one not of air but of expectation, ritual and the slow, inexorable decline of a woman who had made her life a meticulous performance of perfection. Lady Margaret Whitfield sat before the grand mirror in her chamber, the frost from the window panes tracing delicate patterns across the glass. The jars of powders and creams, the brushes, the fine silks of her gowns, all lay arranged with precise care, ready for the morning ritual that had defined her existence for decades. Anne moved quietly beside her, her hands shaking slightly as she prepared the first application of ceruse. Each stroke, each motion, carried the weight of consequence. Each brush upon Margaret's fragile skin was a delicate balance between the preservation of beauty and the infliction of inevitable damage. Margaret's body had become unmistakably frail, the toll of chemical treatments and relentless social obligations visible in the thinness of her limbs, the hollow of her cheeks, the fragility of her skin. Yet still she persisted, her resolve unwavering. "Anne," Margaret whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. "Today, we cannot fail. Every brushstroke, every layer must be flawless. Without this mask, I am nothing." Anne hesitated, concern etched deeply upon her features. "Milady, your skin, it is raw, inflamed. Perhaps we could be gentler today?" Margaret's gaze, fierce and unwavering, met hers in the mirror. "Fragile? Yes, but surrender is not an option. The world sees only the surface, and I must present perfection. It is not vanity. It is survival. Each day the mask shields me from weakness. Each day it protects my place in society." The ritual commenced with painstaking precision. Anne applied the ceruse and rouge with deliberate care, ensuring that each stroke enhanced the illusion while minimizing further harm. Margaret's reflection transformed, yet the mask was increasingly precarious. Tiny scars, subtle discolorations, and the pallor of her weakened body were only partially concealed beneath the layers of powder. Despite this, Margaret maintained her composure, each movement executed with extraordinary discipline. By mid-morning, Margaret's body betrayed her more noticeably. Her hands trembled, Her knees faltered, and her breathing grew shallow. Anne observed these signs with a heart heavy with dread. The powders that once preserved beauty now accelerated the decline of her fragile frame. Each application, though intended to protect, became an act of sacrifice, each moment in front of the mirror a test of endurance. Preparations for the afternoon gathering took the remainder of the morning. Margaret insisted on attending, despite her evident weakness. Her gown, a rich sapphire embroidered with silver thread, flowed elegantly, yet every step required careful guidance. Anne applied the final touches of makeup, her hands gentle, mindful of the delicate skin that bore the repeated toll of chemical application. Each stroke, while preserving the mask of beauty, inflicted further strain upon Margaret's body. The carriage arrived punctually, and Margaret descended the grand staircase with Lord Whitfield at her side. The eyes of society were upon her, measuring every detail, every gesture. Compliments were exchanged, soft and polite. Yet Anne could sense the subtle glances, the quiet whispers that acknowledged the fragility masked beneath elegance. Throughout the gathering, Margaret moved with deliberate grace, her conversation measured, her laughter soft, each gesture executed with meticulous control. Every interaction demanded extraordinary exertion, every movement a battle against the relentless weakening of her body. The powders concealed her flaws temporarily, yet Anne knew the immense price of every hour spent in public. By the evening, Margaret could barely remain upright. She trembled as she returned home, supported by Anne and Lord Whitfield, and was carried to her chamber. The removal of powders revealed unmistakable signs of deterioration. Inflamed, scarred skin, cracked lips, sunken eyes, and faint fevers upon her pale, fragile complexion. Yet her spirit clung stubbornly to the mask she had maintained for decades. "Anne, did they see me as I wished?" she whispered, voice barely audible, eyes glazed. Anne nodded, tears forming. "Yes, milady. To them you were perfection, graceful, elegant, radiant." Margaret allowed a faint, weary smile. "Then the mask has served for another evening." Her nights were haunted by vivid, oppressive dreams. She wandered through endless halls lined with mirrors, each reflection presenting different versions of herself, youthful, decayed, frail, grotesque, and sometimes fading entirely into an indistinct void. She awoke gasping, drenched in sweat, trembling, with Anne at her side offering silent comfort. The physical decline continued relentlessly. Collapses into chairs became frequent. Tremors occurred with increasing regularity. Episodes of fainting threatened her presence in society, yet she persisted, compelled by the rigid standards of appearances and social expectation. Physicians, alarmed, urged restraint, warning of the danger of continued chemical use. Margaret listened politely, but never relinquished control of her mask. Anne pleaded, voice thick with emotion. "Milady, for the sake of your life?" Margaret interrupted firmly yet softly. "Without the mask, I am nothing. Even as my body betrays me, I must continue. It is my choice, my only defense." Each morning, powders were applied meticulously. Every stroke preserved the fragile illusion while simultaneously eroding her body. Anne moved silently, witnessing the slow, inexorable decline. Margaret faced her reflection, fully aware of the truth, yet unable to relinquish the mask that had defined her existence for so long. One afternoon, the snow outside thickened, casting a muted pallor over the city. Margaret paused before the mirror for hours. Her reflection revealed the full consequences of chemical abuse: scars, pallor, fragile, almost translucent skin. Anne knelt beside her, holding her hand, whispering comfort and reassurance. "See beyond the powders, milady," Anne urged softly. "See the strength, the courage, the endurance you have cultivated." Margaret's eyes lingered on her reflection. The frailty, the scars, the shadows beneath her eyes, indisputable. Yet, within the suffering, she recognized the strength forged over years of perseverance, endurance, and the relentless expectations of society. Finally, she whispered, voice barely audible, "Tomorrow, I shall face myself without the mask. I shall confront the world as I truly am." Anne's tears flowed freely, a mixture of relief, grief, and hope. Yes, milady, face the world as you are, and let truth guide you. The winter snow continued to blanket London in muted silence. Within the Whitfield estate, Lady Margaret confronted her reflection with clarity, courage, and a fragile sense of peace. The powders remained, yet she glimpsed freedom, the freedom from illusion, from societal expectation, and from the relentless pursuit of perfection. In that quiet moment, she discovered a dignity that no powder, no mask, no social approval could ever grant. The hours stretched into evening. Margaret reclined in her chair, Anne at her side, observing the flicker of candlelight across her pale, delicate face. The winter wind rattled the windows, yet within the chamber, a stillness settled over them, a fragile calm. Margaret's thoughts wandered, reflecting on the years of ritual, the endless repetitions, the masks she had worn not only for society, but for herself, shielding her from vulnerability and exposure. She reached out, taking Anne's hand, and whispered with faint strength, "Perhaps the mask has served its purpose long enough. Tomorrow, a new path awaits, not for society, not for appearances, but for myself." Anne squeezed her hand tightly, tears shining in her eyes. "Yes, milady, you have endured so much. Now it is time to live for yourself." As the night deepened, the snow outside thickened, blanketing London in silence. Within the Whitfield estate, Lady Margaret Whitfield sat in quiet contemplation, the powders and brushes resting at her side. For the first time in decades, she considered the possibility of shedding the mask entirely, facing herself and the world as she truly was. The fear of imperfection lingered, yet within it arose a fragile courage, a sense of dignity that no chemical, no powder, no social expectation could ever diminish. In that moment, Margaret allowed herself a deep, steadying breath. She looked at Anne and whispered, "Tomorrow, we begin anew. No powders, no masks, only the truth." Anne's lips trembled, a mixture of relief and hope. "Yes, milady, together we will face it, and you will endure, as you always have." Outside, London slept beneath a blanket of snow, unaware of the private revolution occurring within the walls of the Whitfield estate. Inside, Lady Margaret Whitfield, fragile yet resolute, prepared to confront the world and herself without the protective veil that had defined her life for so long. For the first time, the possibility of freedom, authenticity, and dignity stretched before her, as delicate and luminous as the frost patterns on her window pane. The heavy fog of early morning clung stubbornly to London, curling around the cobblestone streets and muffling the distant sounds of carriages and merchants. Snow lay thick upon the roofs and streets, turning the city into a muted landscape of white and gray. Within the Whitfield estate, a different kind of tension permeated the air, a tension born of ritual, expectation, and the slow, inexorable decay of Lady Margaret Whitfield, whose life had long been defined by a relentless pursuit of perfection and the preservation of appearances. Margaret sat before her mirror, the pale light from the frost-laden windows casting a soft glow over the array of powders, creams and delicate brushes arranged with meticulous care. Anne moved beside her, preparing each item with careful, deliberate motions, her hands trembling slightly. Each brushstroke, each layer of cerise or rouge carried consequences. Each application simultaneously preserved Margaret's mask of perfection and further strained her fragile body. "Anne," Margaret whispered, her voice fragile yet firm, "we cannot falter today. Each layer, each stroke, flawless. The world sees only the surface, and I must maintain it." Anne's concern was evident. "Milady, your skin, it is raw, fragile. Perhaps we might apply the powders more gently today?" Margaret's gaze met hers in the mirror, unwavering and sharp. "Fragile? Yes, but surrender is not an option. The mask shields me from weakness, from scrutiny, from imperfection. This is not vanity, it is survival. Every day I endure the ritual, I preserve my place, my dignity, my life in society's eyes." The ritual commenced. Anne applied ceruse and rouge with painstaking precision, each motion deliberate and exact. Margaret's reflection transformed before her, yet the illusion grew increasingly fragile. Tiny scars, subtle discolorations, and the pallor of her weakening body were barely concealed beneath the powders. Despite this, Margaret maintained her composure, each gesture executed with meticulous care and discipline. By mid-morning, Margaret's body betrayed her more evidently. Hands shook, knees faltered, and breathing became shallow. Anne observed these signs with heavy concern. The powders that had once preserved her beauty now acted as instruments of deterioration. Each brushstroke, each application was an act of endurance, a testament to the balance she maintained between appearance and fragility. Preparations for the day's gathering consumed the late morning and early afternoon. Margaret insisted on attending, despite her evident weakness. Her gown, a deep green embroidered with silver lace, flowed elegantly around her form, though every step required guidance and support. Anne applied the final touches of makeup with care, mindful that every application, while preserving the mask of beauty, strained her mistress's body further. The carriage arrived promptly. Margaret descended the grand staircase with Lord Whitfield at her side. The eyes of society were upon her, noting every detail, every gesture. Compliments were polite, restrained. Yet Anne perceived the glances, subtle exchanges, and whispers, acknowledging the fragility beneath her elegance. Throughout the gathering, Margaret moved with deliberate grace. Her conversation was measured, her laughter soft, and each gesture performed with meticulous control. Every interaction required extraordinary exertion, every movement a battle against the relentless weakening of her body. The powders concealed her flaws temporarily, yet Anne understood the immense toll that each hour in society exacted. By evening, Margaret could barely maintain her posture. Trembling, she returned home, supported by Anne and Lord Whitfield, and was carried to her chamber. The removal of the powders revealed the unmistakable signs of decline: inflamed, scarred skin, cracked lips, sunken eyes, and faint fever. Yet Margaret's spirit clung stubbornly to the mask she had worn for decades. "Anne, did they see me as I wished?" she whispered, voice fragile, eyes glistening. Anne nodded, tears forming in her eyes. "Yes, milady. To them, you were elegance, grace, and radiance itself." Margaret allowed a faint, weary smile. "Then it has served. For another evening." The nights were haunted by vivid, oppressive dreams. Endless corridors lined with mirrors reflected multiple versions of herself. Youthful, decayed, frail, grotesque, and sometimes vanishing entirely into shadows. She awoke gasping, drenched in sweat, trembling, with Anne at her side offering silent comfort. Physical weakness intensified. Collapses into chairs became frequent. Tremors occurred during conversation and movement. Fainting threatened her presence in society. Yet she persisted, compelled by societal expectation and personal obsession. Physicians, alarmed by her decline, urged moderation, warning of the dangers of continued chemical use. Margaret listened politely, never relinquishing control over the mask that defined her life. Anne's voice, heavy with concern, pleaded, "Milady, your life." Margaret interrupted softly but firmly. "Without the mask, I am nothing. Even as my body betrays me, I must continue. It is my choice, my only defense." Each morning, powders were applied meticulously. Every stroke preserved the fragile illusion while simultaneously eroding her body. Anne moved silently, witnessing the slow, inexorable decline. Margaret faced her reflection fully aware of the truth, yet unable to relinquish the mask that had defined her existence for decades. One snowy afternoon, Margaret paused before the mirror for hours. Her reflection revealed the full consequences of chemical abuse: scars, pallor, fragile, almost translucent skin. Anne knelt beside her, holding her hand, whispering reassurance and comfort. "See beyond the powders, milady," Anne urged softly. "See the strength, courage, and endurance you have cultivated." Margaret's eyes lingered on her reflection. Frailty, scars, and shadows beneath her eyes were undeniable. Yet within the suffering, she recognized the strength forged through years of perseverance, endurance, and relentless societal expectation. Finally, she whispered, voice barely audible, "Tomorrow, I shall face myself without the mask. I shall confront the world as I truly am." Anne's tears flowed freely, a mixture of relief, grief, and hope. "Yes, milady, face the world as you are, and let truth guide you." Outside, London slept beneath a blanket of snow, unaware of the private revolution occurring within the walls of the Whitfield estate. Inside, Lady Margaret Whitfield, fragile yet resolute, prepared to confront the world, and herself, without the protective veil that had defined her life for so long. The hours stretched into evening. Margaret reclined in her chair, Anne at her side, observing the flicker of candlelight across her delicate, pale face. Thoughts wandered through the labyrinth of years filled with ritual, repetition, and masks worn both for society and for self-preservation. She considered the possibility of shedding the mask entirely, facing herself and the world as she truly was. Fear lingered, yet within it emerged fragile courage and dignity, a recognition that no powder, no mask, no approval could diminish her worth. Margaret took a deep, steadying breath. She reached for Anne's hand and whispered, "Perhaps the mask has served its purpose long enough. Tomorrow, a new path awaits. Not for society, not for appearances, but for myself." Anne squeezed her hand tightly, tears shining. "Yes, milady, you have endured so much. Now it is time to live for yourself." The snow outside deepened, blanketing London in silent serenity. Within the Whitfield estate, Lady Margaret confronted her reflection with clarity, courage, and a fragile sense of peace. The powders and brushes remained beside her, yet she glimpsed the possibility of freedom, the freedom from illusion, from societal expectation, from the relentless pursuit of perfection. In that quiet moment, she discovered a dignity that no mask or chemical could ever grant. For the first time in decades, Margaret allowed herself to imagine life without the veil. The fear of imperfection lingered but was tempered by an emerging awareness. She could endure without pretense. Anne's presence offered reassurance, and together they imagined a world where authenticity and courage mattered more than appearances. The London morning broke beneath a pale, frosted sky, the streets silent beneath a thick blanket of snow that muffled the distant sounds of the city. The fog lay heavy, curling around the chimneys and rooftops, blending into the muted gray of the city's streets. Within the Whitfield estate, the atmosphere was dense with ritual, expectation, and the slow but relentless decline of Lady Margaret Whitfield, whose life had long been devoted to the meticulous preservation of appearances and the relentless pursuit of perfection. Margaret sat before her mirror, the first weak light of day filtering through frost-laden windows, casting an ethereal glow across the array of powders, creams, and brushes laid out with precise order. Anne moved beside her, her hands trembling slightly as she prepared each instrument for the morning ritual. Each brushstroke, each delicate application, carried weight. Each moment both preserved Margaret's mask of perfection and further strained her fragile body. "Anne," Margaret whispered, her voice thin yet unwavering. "Today, we cannot fail. Every stroke, every layer, flawless. Without this mask, I am nothing." Anne's concern was palpable. "Milady, your skin, it is raw, inflamed. Perhaps we could take a lighter approach today." Margaret's gaze, sharp and unyielding, met hers in the mirror. "Fragile? Yes, but surrender is not an option. The world sees only the surface, and I must present perfection. This is not vanity, it is survival. Every day the mask shields me from weakness, scrutiny, and imperfection. Every day it preserves my dignity, my place, my life in society's eyes." The ritual commenced with painstaking precision. Anne applied the ceruse and rouge delicately, each motion deliberate and exact. Margaret's reflection transformed before her eyes, yet the mask was increasingly fragile. Tiny scars, subtle discolorations, and the pallor of her weakened body were barely concealed beneath layers of powder. Despite this, Margaret maintained her composure, each movement executed with extraordinary discipline and care. By mid-morning, Margaret's body betrayed her more overtly. Hands shook, knees faltered, breathing became shallow. Anne observed these signs with deep concern. The powders that once preserved her beauty now acted as instruments of deterioration. Each brushstroke, each application, was both a preservation of perfection and an infliction of harm, a delicate balance she maintained with endless endurance. Preparations for the day's social engagement consumed the remainder of the morning. Margaret insisted on attending, despite her weakness. Her gown, a rich sapphire with intricate silver embroidery, flowed elegantly, though every step required careful support. Anne applied the final touches of makeup with caution, aware that each layer, while preserving the illusion, taxed her mistress's fragile frame. The carriage arrived promptly. Margaret descended the grand staircase with Lord Whitfield at her side. Eyes in society scrutinized her, noting every detail, every gesture. Compliments were given, restrained and polite. Yet Anne perceived subtle glances and quiet whispers acknowledging the fragility beneath her elegance. Throughout the gathering, Margaret moved with deliberate grace. Her conversation was measured, laughter soft, gestures precise. Every interaction demanded enormous exertion, every movement a battle against the relentless weakening of her body. The powders concealed flaws temporarily, yet Anne knew the tremendous cost of each hour spent under society's gaze. By evening, Margaret could barely remain upright. She trembled as she returned home, supported by Anne and Lord Whitfield, and was carried to her chamber. The removal of powders revealed unmistakable signs of decline: inflamed, scarred skin, cracked lips, sunken eyes, and faint fevers across her pale, delicate frame. Yet Margaret's spirit clung stubbornly to the mask she had worn for decades. "Anne, did they see me as I wished?" she whispered, voice weak, eyes glassy. Anne nodded, tears welling. "Yes, milady. To them, you were elegance, grace, and radiance itself." Margaret allowed a faint, weary smile. "Then it has served for another evening." Her nights were haunted by vivid, oppressive dreams. Endless halls lined with mirrors reflected multiple versions of herself: youthful, decayed, frail, grotesque, and sometimes fading entirely into indistinct shadows. She awoke, gasping, drenched in sweat, trembling, with Anne at her side offering silent comfort. Physical weakness intensified. Collapses into chairs became frequent. Tremors appeared more regularly. Fainting threatened her presence in society. Yet she persisted, compelled by societal expectations and personal obsession. Physicians, alarmed by her decline, urged restraint, warning of the dangers of continued chemical use. Margaret listened politely, but never relinquished control over the mask that had defined her life. Anne pleaded, voice heavy with emotion, "Milady, your life." Margaret interrupted firmly yet softly. "Without the mask, I am nothing. Even as my body betrays me, I must continue. It is my choice, my only defense." Each morning, powders were applied meticulously. Every stroke preserved the fragile illusion while simultaneously eroding her body. Anne moved silently, witnessing the slow, inexorable decline. Margaret faced her reflection, fully aware of the truth, yet unable to relinquish the mask that had defined her existence for decades. One snowy afternoon, Margaret paused before the mirror for hours. Her reflection revealed the full consequences of chemical abuse: scars, pallor, fragile, nearly translucent skin. Anne knelt beside her, holding her hand, whispering comfort and reassurance. "See beyond the powders, milady," Anne urged softly. "See the strength, courage, and endurance you have cultivated." Margaret's gaze lingered on her reflection. Frailty, scars, shadows beneath her eyes, indisputable. Yet within the suffering, she recognized the strength forged through years of perseverance, endurance, and relentless societal expectation. Finally, she whispered, voice barely audible, "Tomorrow, I shall face myself without the mask. I shall confront the world as I truly am." Anne's tears flowed freely, a mixture of relief, grief, and hope. "Yes, milady, Face the world as you are, and let truth guide you. Outside, London slept beneath a blanket of snow, unaware of the private revolution occurring within the walls of the Whitfield estate. Inside, Lady Margaret Whitfield, fragile yet resolute, prepared to confront the world, and herself, without the protective veil that had defined her life for so long. The hours stretched into evening. Margaret reclined in her chair, Anne at her side, observing the flicker of candlelight across her delicate, pale face. Thoughts wandered through the labyrinth of years filled with ritual, repetition, and masks worn both for society and self-preservation. She imagined shedding the mask entirely, facing herself in the world as she truly was. Fear lingered, tempered by an emerging courage, a recognition that no powder, mask, or approval could diminish her worth. Margaret took a deep, steadying breath. She reached for Anne's hand and whispered, "Perhaps. The mask has served its purpose long enough. Tomorrow, a new path awaits. Not for society, not for appearances, but for myself." Anne squeezed her hand tightly, tears shining. "Yes, milady, you have endured so much. Now it is time to live for yourself." The snow outside deepened, blanketing London in silent serenity. Within the Whitfield estate, Lady Margaret confronted her reflection with clarity, courage, and a fragile sense of peace. The powders and brushes remained beside her, yet she glimpsed the possibility of freedom, the freedom from illusion, societal expectation, and relentless pursuit of perfection. In that quiet moment, she discovered a dignity that no mask or chemical could ever grant. The frost-covered streets of London lay silent beneath the pale, early light of morning. Snow blanketed the city in a muted calm, muffling the distant clatter of carriages and the voices of merchants beginning their day. Within the grand Whitfield estate, the air was thick with ritual, expectation, and the unrelenting progression of Lady Margaret Whitfield's decline, a decline born of decades-long obsession with beauty, societal approval, and the preservation of a fragile, carefully maintained facade. Margaret sat before her grand mirror, the pale daylight casting intricate patterns of frost across the glass. Before her lay the familiar array of powders, creams, and brushes, each item meticulously arranged. Anne moved beside her, hands trembling slightly, preparing the instruments that had become both tools of perfection and instruments of harm. Each brushstroke, each delicate application, carried a dual weight, to preserve the mask of beauty and to simultaneously strain Margaret's fragile body. "Anne," Margaret whispered, her voice fragile but resolute, "we cannot falter today. Every stroke, every layer, must be flawless. Without this mask I am nothing." Anne's concern was immediate, her hands faltering slightly. "Milady, your skin, it is raw, inflamed. Perhaps we might use a gentler touch today." Margaret's gaze fixed firmly on hers in the mirror. "Fragile? Yes, but surrender is not permitted. The world sees only the surface, and I must preserve it. This is not vanity, it is survival. Every layer, every stroke, shields me from scrutiny and protects my place, my dignity, my existence in society's eyes." The ritual began in painstaking detail. Anne applied ceruse and rouge delicately, every motion exact, every stroke calculated to maintain the fragile illusion. Margaret's reflection transformed, yet the mask was increasingly precarious. Tiny scars, subtle discolorations, and the pallor of her weakened body were partially hidden beneath the layers of powder. Despite this, Margaret maintained her composure, every movement executed with extraordinary discipline. By mid-morning, Margaret's body betrayed her more overtly. Hands trembled, knees faltered, and breath came shallowly. Anne observed the signs with heavy concern. The powders that had once preserved her beauty now acted as subtle instruments of deterioration. Each brushstroke, each layer, was both an attempt to maintain perfection and an unavoidable strain on her weakened frame. Preparations for the day's gathering consumed the remainder of the morning. Margaret insisted on attending, despite her visible weakness. Her gown, deep emerald adorned with intricate silver embroidery, flowed elegantly, though every step required guidance and support. Anne applied the final touches of makeup with utmost care, aware that each layer, while preserving the mask, further taxed her mistress's body. The carriage arrived promptly. Margaret descended the grand staircase, Lord Whitfield at her side. The eyes of society were upon her, noting every detail, every gesture. Compliments were polite, restrained, but Anne could sense subtle glances and whispers, acknowledging the fragility beneath her elegance. Throughout the gathering, Margaret moved with deliberate grace. Conversation was measured, laughter soft, gestures precise. Every interaction demanded extraordinary exertion. Every movement was a battle against her body's relentless weakening. The powders concealed her flaws temporarily, yet Anne knew the enormous cost of each hour under society's scrutiny. By evening, Margaret could barely remain upright. She trembled as she returned home, supported by Anne and Lord Whitfield, and was carried to her chamber. The removal of powders revealed unmistakable signs of decline. Inflamed, scarred skin, cracked lips, sunken eyes, and faint fevers. Yet Margaret's spirit clung stubbornly to the mask she had worn for decades. "Anne, did they see me as I wished?" she whispered, voice frail, eyes glistening. Anne nodded, tears welling. "Yes, milady. To them, you were elegance, grace, and radiance itself." Margaret allowed a faint, weary smile. "Then it has served for another evening." Her nights were haunted by vivid, oppressive dreams. Endless corridors lined with mirrors reflected multiple versions of herself, youthful, decayed, frail, grotesque, and sometimes fading entirely into shadow. She awoke gasping, drenched in sweat, trembling, with Anne at her side offering silent comfort. Physical weakness intensified. Collapses into chairs became frequent. Tremors grew more pronounced. Fainting threatened her presence in society, yet she persisted, compelled by societal expectation and personal obsession. Physicians, alarmed by her decline, urged restraint, warning of the dangers of continued chemical use. Margaret listened politely, but never relinquished control over the mask that defined her life. Anne's voice, heavy with concern, pleaded, "Milady, for the sake of your life." Margaret interrupted firmly yet softly. "Without the mask, I am nothing. Even as my body betrays me, I must continue. It is my choice, my only defense." Each morning, powders were applied meticulously. Every stroke preserved the fragile illusion while simultaneously eroding her body. Anne moved silently, witnessing the slow, inexorable decline. Margaret faced her reflection fully aware of the truth, yet unable to relinquish the mask that had defined her existence for decades. One snowy afternoon, Margaret paused before the mirror for hours. Her reflection revealed the full consequences of chemical abuse: scars, pallor, fragile, nearly translucent skin. Anne knelt beside her, holding her hand, whispering reassurance and comfort. "See beyond the powders, milady," Anne urged softly. "See the strength, courage, and endurance you have cultivated." Margaret's gaze lingered on her reflection. Frailty, scars, shadows beneath her eyes, undeniable. Yet within the suffering, she recognized the strength forged through years of perseverance, endurance, and societal expectation. "Finally," she whispered, voice barely audible, "tomorrow, I shall face myself without the mask. I shall confront the world as I truly am." Anne's tears flowed freely, a mixture of relief, grief, and hope. "Yes, milady, face the world as you are, and let truth guide you." Outside, London slept beneath a blanket of snow, unaware of the private revolution occurring within the walls of the Whitfield estate. Inside, Lady Margaret Whitfield, fragile yet resolute, prepared to confront the world and herself without the protective veil that had defined her life for so long. Hours stretched into evening. Margaret reclined in her chair, Anne at her side, observing the flicker of candlelight across her delicate, pale face. Thoughts wandered through the labyrinth of years filled with ritual, repetition, and masks worn both for society and for self-preservation. She imagined shedding the mask entirely, facing herself and the world as she truly was. Fear lingered, but was tempered by emerging courage, a recognition that no powder, mask, or approval could diminish her worth. Margaret took a deep, steadying breath. She reached for Anne's hand and whispered, "Perhaps the mask has served its purpose long enough. Tomorrow, a new path awaits. Not for society, not for appearances, but for myself." Anne squeezed her hand tightly, tears shining. "Yes, milady, you have endured so much. Now it is time to live for yourself." The snow outside deepened, blanketing London in silent serenity. Within the Whitfield estate, Lady Margaret confronted her reflection with clarity, courage, and a fragile sense of peace. The powders and brushes remained beside her, yet she glimpsed the possibility of freedom, the freedom from illusion, from societal expectation, and from the relentless pursuit of perfection. In that quiet moment, she discovered a dignity that no mask or chemical could ever grant. The winter morning in London dawned cold and muted, the streets blanketed in snow that glistened faintly beneath the soft, pale light. A thick fog clung stubbornly to the cobblestones, curling around chimneys and rooftops, swallowing the distant sounds of merchants and carriages. The city seemed still, as though holding its breath for the events unfolding within the Whitfield estate, where Lady Margaret Whitfield was about to confront the culmination of decades of obsession, ritual, and personal sacrifice. Margaret sat before her grand mirror, her reflection pale and fragile under the soft daylight filtering through frost-laced windows. The familiar array of powders, creams, and brushes lay meticulously arranged at her side, yet today they seemed less a shield and more a symbol of everything she had endured. Anne stood beside her, hands trembling, knowing that this final confrontation with herself would define not only Margaret's life, but the way she would be remembered, and more importantly, the freedom she would finally claim. "Anne," Margaret whispered, voice thin yet resolute, "today, the mask is no longer needed. Every stroke, every layer, must be laid down. I am done pretending." Anne's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded, understanding that this was the moment her mistress had been preparing for silently for years. "Milady, it is time. You have endured so much, and now the world need not see your mask, only your truth." Margaret reached for the brushes, her hand trembling slightly. She stared at her reflection, taking in the scars, the pallor, the subtle discolorations, the marks of decades of chemical abuse, societal pressure, and personal obsession. For so long, she had hidden behind powders, rouge, and carefully orchestrated gestures. Today, she would reveal herself fully, without protection, without illusion. Anne began removing the first layers of ceruse, her hands careful and deliberate. Each stroke revealed the delicate, fragile skin beneath, and each moment seemed to carry the weight of history itself. Margaret's breathing grew shallow as the layers came off, yet she remained seated, confronting the reflection that had both haunted and defined her. Hours passed. The ritual of removal was painstaking, deliberate. Margaret watched as each brushstroke stripped away the facade, revealing the truth she had long hidden from the world and even from herself. Anne worked silently, offering comfort and occasional whispered encouragement. "You are strong, milady. You have endured everything, and now you are free." The process was not without pain. Tiny sores, cracks, and inflamed patches became visible as the protective powders were removed. Margaret winced, her hands gripping the edge of the dressing table, yet she did not retreat. The endurance that had carried her through decades of societal scrutiny and self-imposed ritual now manifested as courage, the courage to face herself and the world unmasked. Finally, after hours of careful removal, Margaret's reflection stared back at her in unguarded honesty. The woman in the mirror was fragile, scarred, pale, and weathered, yet there was a profound dignity in her gaze. She was no longer the artificial perfection that society demanded. She was herself, fully and irrevocably. Margaret turned to Anne, eyes moist but clear. "Anne, I see it now. The mask, it was never me. The real strength, the real life, is beneath it." Anne nodded, tears streaming freely. "Yes, milady, you have survived everything, and now you can truly live." With deliberate care, Margaret rose from her chair. Each step was measured, cautious, yet there was a new grace in her movement, a grace not born of social expectation, but of authenticity. She walked through the chambers of the Whitfield estate, each room a testament to the life she had endured and the rituals she had maintained. The echoes of the past whispered around her, yet she faced them without fear, without illusion, and without pretense. Outside, the snow continued to blanket London in silent serenity. The city remained unaware of the private revolution that had occurred within the Whitfield estate. Yet within those walls, Lady Margaret Whitfield had reclaimed her life, her body, and her dignity. No powders, no masks, no societal expectation could diminish the resilience and courage that now defined her existence. Margaret paused by the large window overlooking the estate gardens, the snow-covered branches shimmering in the pale light. She breathed deeply, inhaling the cold, crisp air, and felt an unfamiliar lightness, a liberation from the decades of obsession with perfection. The scars on her skin, the pallor, and the subtle imperfections were not weaknesses. They were the story of endurance, survival, and the human capacity to reclaim oneself. Anne approached, her presence steady and reassuring. "Milady, what will you do now?" Margaret smiled faintly, a smile that held both exhaustion and profound clarity. "Now, I will live, not for appearances, not for society, not for masks, but for myself. Each breath, each step, each choice will be mine alone." Days passed. Margaret adapted slowly to her unmasked existence. Society still observed, still commented, still judged, but she no longer sought their approval. Each encounter was met with quiet confidence, each gesture, each word measured by her own standards, not the impossible expectations of others. The powders and brushes were placed on a shelf, a relic of a life now behind her. Margaret began to explore pursuits long neglected, walking through the snow-dusted gardens, reading books she had been denied time for, and spending hours in quiet reflection. Anne remained a constant companion, guiding her through the fragile days of adjustment and offering unwavering support. Margaret's health, though never fully restored, stabilized as she abandoned the rituals that had drained her vitality. In time, Margaret found herself writing letters and journals, chronicling her experiences, the lessons learned, and the truths uncovered through decades of endurance and struggle. Her writings were candid, unflinching, and filled with the wisdom born of suffering and survival. She documented not only the physical consequences of the toxic beauty practices she had endured, but also the psychological toll, the relentless pressure of societal expectation, the fear of imperfection, and the courage required to reclaim one's life. Months passed. The Whitfield estate remained a sanctuary, a place of quiet contemplation and genuine connection. Margaret, though still frail, moved with a dignity untainted by artificial masks. The city outside continued in its daily rhythm, yet within those walls, a profound transformation had occurred. Margaret had shed the illusions that had bound her for decades, revealing a life defined not by societal approval, but by authenticity, endurance, and self-determination. One winter evening, as the sun set behind the frosted rooftops of London, Margaret stood once more by the window, gazing at the snow-covered gardens. Anne joined her silently, and for a moment, no words were spoken. The silence was not empty. It was full of acknowledgement, understanding, and the quiet triumph of survival. Margaret finally spoke, voice steady and resolute. "Anne, I am ready. Ready to face each day as myself, unmasked, unguarded, and unapologetic. The world may see what it will, but I know who I am." Anne smiled, tears glinting in the fading light. "Yes, milady, and that is all that matters. You have endured everything, and now you are free." As the last rays of sunlight glimmered across the frost-covered gardens, Lady Margaret Whitfield felt a profound sense of peace. The decades of ritual, the obsessive pursuit of perfection, the masks she had worn for society, everything had culminated in this moment of clarity and liberation. She stood tall, fragile yet resolute, and embraced the life she had reclaimed. The snow fell softly outside, blanketing the city in silence and serenity. Within the Whitfield estate, Lady Margaret Whitfield, once defined by powders, perfection, and societal expectation, now existed in her truth, scarred, pale, imperfect, yet wholly, irrevocably herself. The mask was gone, the facade dissolved, and in its place remained dignity, endurance, and the enduring courage of a life reclaimed. For the first time in decades, Margaret walked freely through her chambers and gardens, each step a testament to survival, authenticity, and the profound liberation that comes from embracing one's truth. Anne followed silently, a faithful witness to the transformation, offering support, companionship, and affirmation. Margaret's reflection in the frost-laced windows was no longer an illusion. It was the honest depiction of a woman who had endured, suffered, and ultimately triumphed over expectation, obsession, and self-imposed oppression. As night fell, the city outside remained unaware, the world continuing in its rhythm. Yet within the Whitfield estate, a private revolution had occurred. A revolution not of politics, wealth, or power, but of self, courage, and the unshakable pursuit of truth. Lady Margaret Whitfield had shed the toxic pursuit of perfection, and in doing so, had discovered a freedom that no societal expectation could ever take away. In the quiet of the Whitfield estate, Lady Margaret Whitfield, once bound by powders, appearances, and obsession, now existed in serene authenticity. She had confronted herself, endured the cost of decades-long rituals, and emerged liberated, dignified, and profoundly human. Her life, though forever marked by the trials she had faced, was now hers to live fully, honestly, and unapologetically.